This is BBC News. I'm Jo Coburn. The headlines. Counting continues as results come in from elections held across England, Scotland and Wales. The SNP gains seats in Scotland, but its hopes of securing an overall majority remain on a knife edge. The Deputy First Minister says they will push for another referendum.
There will be a majority of members elected to the Scottish Parliament who will be committed to the hosting of an independence referendum. That's a fundamental democratic point. That's what the people of Scotland will have voted for.
Labour performs strongly in Wales, matching its best ever Senedd election result. The Conservatives continue to make significant gains in England after their by-election win in Hartlepool. Results of regional mayoral contests are expected today. Good morning and welcome to BBC News. Counting has resumed in counts across Britain. In Scotland, the SNP are on course to win their fourth term in power. But Nicola Sturgeon admitted the prospect of an overall majority in Holyrood is on a knife edge. The Prime Minister Boris Johnson has repeated that he would reject any calls for a second independence referendum. Let's take a look at the state of play in Scotland. Obviously, plenty more seats to be declared, both in the constituencies and in the list seats. But as we can see there so far, 48 out of the 129 seats in Holyrood declared so far. The SNP on 39. That's up 3. The Liberal Democrats are on 4. The Conservatives are on 3, having dropped 2 of those to the SNP. Labour so far are on 2, having dropped 1 to the SNP, as you can see there. Mark Drakeford's Welsh Labour is set to remain in power after matching its best ever Senedd election results. Let's take a look at the results in Wales so far. Labour are currently on 30 seats, up 1. Conservatives are the second largest party, up 4, and Plaid are on 9. They're down 1 seat, having lost that seat in the Senedd yesterday. Leanne Wood, the former leader of Plaid Cymru, losing her seat in the Rhondda. Across England, the results of mayoral contests in London, Greater Manchester and the West Midlands are expected later today. Labour is hoping to win them after losing that crucial Hartlepool by-election yesterday and ceding control of key councils in England. Let's have a look at the change in councillors across England. You can see there the parties. Boris Johnson's Conservative Party up 159. That's a good result so far for them as the governing party. Disappointing, as you can see there, for Labour and Sir Keir Starmer, down 192. The Liberal Democrats with Sir Ed Davey are down in their tally of 24 so far. And the Greens, the co-leaders you can see there, are up 51. Well, we'll have the latest from across the UK and we'll be joined by our election analyst, Professor Sir John Curtis, to take us through what to look out for during today. But first of all, let's speak to our chief political correspondent, Adam Fleming. Adam, hello to you. Tell us where we are.
Morning, Jo. Well, we're waiting for the final result from the Scottish Parliament, as you were just discussing, and then we're waiting to see how the UK government responds to that. I think the challenge for Boris Johnson is how does he look like a Prime Minister for the whole United Kingdom rather than just the Prime Minister for England? And he will be thinking, how does he respond to this in a way where he can say no to a referendum, but not in a way that actually gives a further boost to the cause of the SNP. We're not exactly sure yet how the Prime Minister will actually address all of this, whether we'll hear from him or see him at all today. But we got a bit of a preview about what the government thinks and might say from George Eustice, the Environment Secretary.
See how the results pan out later today. It's questionable at the moment whether the SNP will get a majority or not. We'll have to wait and see till the results come through. The UK government's position is very clear on this. We don't think there's a case for another referendum, particularly now as we try to chart a way out of the pandemic and get our economy going again. We will obviously deal with whatever we have to deal with once these elections are settled and once the new Scottish administration decides what it wants to do.
Two little hints there about the government's view. One, kind of calling into question the mandate that the SNP receives from these elections now that it looks like they might not get a majority, and also just sort of preparing for the long haul, I think, because this won't be a process that is over today or this weekend or maybe even this year. Now, in terms of what else we're waiting for, you set out some of the other results we'll get later today. I think Labour will be pinning their hopes on the victories that are almost inevitable in Manchester, in Bristol and in London, although it'll be interesting to see if the opposition parties have nibbled away at the Labour vote in those places. But we're still going to have this big row in the Labour Party about what to do about the results yesterday, where Labour lost councillors in all sorts of parts of England where at this point in the political cycle they should have been winning them. And we heard this morning from a big ally of Keir Starmer. It's the Shadow Home Secretary, Nick Thomas-Symonds.
What I want to see now is the Keir Starmer that I know. Keir's not had the chance to actually speak to a room of people over the past 12 months as leader of the Labour Party. And I know throughout his career, I was inspired to back him as leader of the Labour Party because of tackling injustice, tackling inequality. I'm looking forward to him now conducting that policy review and setting that out and trying to reconnect with people like those in Hartlepool that we've lost touch with.
So confirmation there that Labour will launch a policy review. I mean, in simple terms, that is reviewing the policies they've got, deciding if they're fit for purpose, and then potentially replacing them with new ones. And that may be a solution to Labour's problems in the long term, but it might create some new problems in the short term, because that could be quite a divisive process in the Labour Party, because you've got plenty of people, particularly on the very left wing of the party, who like all those Corbyn-era policies, like free broadband and lots of nationalisations. Then you've got people on the centre of the party who really don't like those policies at all. So actually, the row that we saw brewing yesterday after the election results could continue in Labour for quite a long time.
Right. I mean, while there's this soul-searching going on within Labour, your talk of a policy review that's been announced won't fill everybody with joy exactly, will it, Adam, in terms of trying to deal with the problems right now? Do you think they are considering that the realignment from Brexit is becoming more permanent?
Now, that is an interesting thing, and that you will see from when you speak to John Curtis. He's been looking at the polls for the last few months. And when I was chatting to him last week, he was saying there is no sign that Labour are picking up votes amongst people who voted to leave, which calls into question the whole Labour strategy of just zipping it when it comes to Brexit. And you might get some people saying, well, actually, maybe Labour should take a more kind of activist stance when it comes to the fallout from the Brexit trade deal, or you might get them carrying on their position of just not getting involved at all. But the whole point about Brexit is we thought it was done as a process, and it is. There's a trade deal with the EU, but the after effects are lingering on. In Hartlepool, one of the reasons the Conservative Party won was that people who'd voted for the Brexit Party last time decided to vote for the Conservatives this time rather than going back to Labour as they might have done historically. So that is the dilemma for Labour, because they're going to have to respond to that, because Hartlepool has just shown that is the long-term Brexit effect in British politics. And that was felt in lots of other places yesterday in the English local authority results, not just in the Hartlepool by-election result.
Right, well, Adam, let's just stick with Labour for the moment before we talk about the Conservatives and Boris Johnson and the government, because this idea of Labour and Sir Keir Starmer taking responsibility for the results, we had that softening up, in fact, before the polls actually closed. But what are they going to do? What are these radical changes that I keep hearing from Labour politicians that are going to actually happen? Do you have any idea?
I'll be honest, I don't.
No.
And Keir Starmer doesn't seem to either, because he did quite a long interview yesterday with broadcasters and he couldn't give specifics about what he might do. I mean, there's speculation in the papers today, like, do they move Labour's HQ to a different city? I was chatting to one of the MPs who proudly calls themselves a socialist yesterday, and they're going to have a meeting of the socialist campaign group of MPs next week, where they're going to start working some pretty radical proposals for reforming the party. One of the ideas they've got is, do you have a fully federal Labour Party in England where you have people, regional leaders who've got quite a lot of autonomy, and then your person at Westminster is basically your candidate for Prime Minister and your coordinator of all those regional Labour parties? Or do you have a party of parties where actually you team up with maybe the Greens and you have a much broader coalition, and that's how you win the next election? Now, we all know some people in the Labour Party love nothing more than discussing that sort of stuff. But a part of me thinks that when you hear people saying, oh, let's look at whether we have a fully federal Labour Party or not, you think, is that going to help them win the next election?
I'll leave that question hanging for viewers to make up their own minds. On the Conservatives, you'll remember in the 2019 election, that big majority for Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister then said that people had lent their votes, that they were sort of borrowed, if you like, from the former Labour strongholds, the former heartlands of parts of the North East and the Midlands. In order to hold on to them, this levelling up agenda, this investment that is supposedly heading for those parts of the country, a white paper is due in the autumn. There's no real urgency, is there? Voters might get tired of hearing about it but not seeing it in action.
Well, that's a very interesting question, isn't it? Because that comes down to how quickly do people want to see action, and actually are they prepared to give Boris Johnson a couple of years, for example, before they then see some concrete results in their town, their village, their suburb? So there's that. And then there's the question of the political process that goes into that white paper, because you talk to people around about Westminster and they're not exactly clear what levelling up is. And so then you've got the risk that it takes the government too long to actually decide what it is, that then collides with people's view of how long they're prepared to give the government to take. So, I mean, that's a fascinating question, and one that will kind of dominate our politics for the next couple of years. And also then there's just the whole idea of, do people see levelling up as a sort of feeling about the country? And actually they don't expect to see, I don't know, a new airport at the end of their road or a brand new spruced up city centre in a couple of years. And actually it's just tapped into a feeling of pride and optimism, which, let's face it, is Boris Johnson's #1 skill. And actually it's about the feeling of levelling up rather than actually doing it.
Adam Fleming in Westminster, thank you very much, and we'll talk to you later on in the programme. So that's the situation in terms of Boris Johnson and the Conservative government and the Labour Party. Let's catch up with what is happening in Scotland and those critical elections to Holyrood. We've had 48 of the 129 seats declared. Most of those, of course, all of those, I should say, are constituency seats so far. We'll be hearing some of the list results, the proportional part of the election. We're going to go to Galloway and West Dumfries. Let's cross to our reporter Connor Gillis, who is there at the count. Connor, what can you tell us? We can see countings resume behind you.
Yeah, it has indeed, Jo. An interesting day ahead for Scotland, but an interesting day here in Dumfries as well. As you mentioned, the verification process is now underway again this morning in the Galloway and West Dumfries constituency. It is a much slower affair across a couple of days, as is the case across the UK because of COVID at the moment. Usually there would be more than 100 people down here counting the votes in the hall in Dumfries. That at the moment is in the region of about 50 people doing that job. So that shows you the scale of the challenge and the length of time, the extra length of time that this is taking to get through everything that they need to do. Now, yesterday, this part of the world, Dumfriesshire, was held by the Conservatives, and actually Oliver Mundell, the MSP who was elected, increased his majority by 10%. The SNP also added on quite a few extra votes as well. It is a straight fight in this constituency, as is the same across Scotland, dividing along those constitutional lines, the yes and the no, and that is borne out by the figures that we're seeing in this part of the world as well. This count today, Galloway and West Dumfries sits the southern tip of Scotland. It also includes the port of Stranraer, a key factor in the Brexit process, a key port going across to Northern Ireland, and the Tories got 43% of the vote here in 2016. Can the SNP make gains? Well, we'll find out in a few hours' time. The South of Scotland regional list is, of course, due to declare today. The smaller parties are hoping to come into their own in that part of the voting process, and we could see the likes of the former MP George Galloway making a breakthrough, his All for Unity party hoping to take a seat here in the South of Scotland.
Thank you very much there as counting resumes again today. We're going to talk to my colleague BBC Newsnight's policy editor Lewis Goodall. He is at the touchscreen with the latest results from Scotland. Lewis, the question of course today is how likely is it that the SNP can get an overall majority from here? Looking less likely.
Yes, Jo, I think the answer is that it is possible but not probable. What did the SNP have to do in this election? Some would say that what they wanted most of all was to get that majority. They needed 65 seats in the Scottish Parliament to do it. They will be very, very close. They do dominate in the Scottish constituencies. The Scottish constituencies we haven't already had, you will see most of them will return an SNP member. And they needed, though, in terms of the crucial constituencies, the marginal constituencies, they basically needed to win 6 of these seats that you can see here in order to get to 65. Well, we started off pretty well for the SNP, didn't we? They took air from the Conservatives in the west of Scotland. Then we went over to East Lothian, which used to be Ian Gray's seat in the east of Scotland here. We can see the result here there. The SNP took that seat with a majority of 1,179. All good as far as it went. Then we were moved on as well to Edinburgh Central. Absolutely superb result for the SNP in Edinburgh Central here. Angus Robertson took the seat. This was, of course, Ruth Davidson's seat in the old Parliament. Took it, well, by an absolute country mile, really. 39% of the vote, eating into the Labour share of the vote, eating into the Green share of the vote, ending up with 4,732. That was absolutely crucial in order to get to 65. But then things started to go wrong because we got to Dumbarton, Jackie Bailey's seat in the Scottish Parliament. This was the number one target for the SNP. In the number one target for the SNP. But look what happened. Jackie Bailey ended up increasing her majority to 1,483. How did she do it? It only required a tiny, tiny swing. This is how they did it. Effectively, you saw a unionist tactical set of voting from the Conservatives, straight exchange to the Labour Party. Conservative voters holding their nose. Why? Doing it to vote for the Labour Party in order to keep the SNP out, in order to ensure that they didn't get to that 65, that magical figure. We saw the same thing we were just hearing about Dumfriesshire there. Very, very similar thing happened down there. Actually, quite a relatively small majority was required. Let's see what happened there. Same thing, but in the other direction. Labour voters holding their nose and voting for the Conservatives in a straight unionist tactical set of voting to keep the SNP out, to keep them from getting to 65. Now, this has meant that there is a narrow path, because they didn't win the SNP, Dumfriesshire, and they didn't win Eastwood, and they didn't win Dumbarton. That means there is still a technical narrow path that might enable them to get to 65, but it would require them to win the seats of Galloway, which we were just hearing about, and Aberdeenshire West. Galloway needs a 2.3% swing from the Conservatives to the SNP to win it. Aberdeenshire West only needs a 1.3% swing from the Conservatives to the SNP to win it. Sounds entirely plausible, doesn't it? Except, of course, from what we were just hearing about, because we were just hearing about that tactical voting. Now, assuming that that happens in those seats as well, in Aberdeenshire West and in Galloway, then that could be a big problem, because look at the swings that we saw in the seats that we were just talking about, the ones that were held, that the SNP didn't take. In Dumfriesshire, there was a swing of 3.3% away from the SNP to the Conservatives. In Eastwood, there was a 0.4% swing away from the SNP to the Conservatives. In Dumbarton, there was a 1.8% swing away from the SNP to the Labour Party. Now, assuming that something similar happens in the remaining seats of Aberdeenshire West and in Galloway, then that would make it difficult in that case, we imagine, for them to get to 65. Even if the SNP manage to take those seats, they would still require an extra seat, probably in the Highlands and Islands, on the regional list in order to make that happen. So to answer your question, Jo, as I say, it's possible, but it's looking unlikely, or less likely than it looked at certain points yesterday anyway. And of course, the SNP will say that is not the only metric here. It is difficult in the additional member system to get a majority, to get to 65. The fact they're even anywhere close shows the hegemony, the dominance they have over Scottish politics. That what we should be looking at is the number of pro-independence MSPs in the Scottish Parliament in Holyrood. And of course, we expect that to expand with a Green surge, who are, of course, the Green Party in Scotland in favour of independence. But that will be the political argument which ensues between Westminster and Holyrood, and in Holyrood itself, indeed in Westminster itself, in the coming days. What that mandate constitutes, what it means in terms of the composition of the parties in Holyrood.
Lewis Goodall, that's all fascinating, and I think it does indicate long arguments ahead over constitutional issues. We'll be hoping to speak to the SNP later on this morning, but let's pick up on some of those issues that were raised by Lewis there with our polling expert and elections guru, Professor Sir John Curtis, about all the latest results. Good morning to you, John. Nice to see you there. The SNP are on course to form a government for a fourth consecutive term. Is there any material difference to winning an outright majority that is looking very difficult, as Lewis was explaining, and having a pro-independence majority at Holyrood with the Greens in terms of their leverage for a second independence referendum?
I think the answer to that lies in the likely reaction of 10 Downing Street and the degree of moral pressure that the SNP can put on the Prime Minister. Back in 2011, the SNP did get an overall majority. And it was by virtue of the fact that they had acquired that majority that the then Prime Minister David Cameron accepted that the SNP had secured, quote, the moral right, unquote, to hold a ballot, and that was the ballot that was held in 2014. So if the SNP were to get an overall majority, the question that we posed to Boris Johnson would be, well, if it was good enough for David Cameron, why isn't it good enough for you? The fact, if the SNP don't have an overall majority, then at least that question cannot be posed to the Prime Minister, even though, in fact, underlying all these figures, we're probably looking at a record SNP share of the vote so far as the constituency vote is concerned. Actually, the SNP only got about 45% of the vote back in 2011. The electoral system is simply not going to be so kind in that respect. But the other thing I want you to say about all of this is that, there'll be a lot of rhetoric on both sides about what this election in Scotland does or does not mean. I think the only honest way to look at it is what this result does is to confirm the evidence of the opinion polls that Scotland is fundamentally divided down the middle on the question of its constitutional status. The polls have been saying it's about 50% support for independence. And I think when we add up the votes, we're going to discover that it's roughly 50% for the parties in favour of independence and roughly 50% for the parties in favour of the union. And we know from the opinion polls that virtually everybody who would vote yes in the independence referendum was going to vote for the SNP, and conversely, virtually everybody who would vote no in the independence referendum was going to vote for one of the unionist parties. So the polls and the results are in agreement. To that extent, at least, neither Boris Johnson nor Nicola Sturgeon actually clearly command the support of voters in Scotland. Any referendum would be a remarkable risk for both sides. And therefore, perhaps in the end, we may discover that both sides might play this perhaps a little more carefully than some of the rhetoric during the election campaign might have led us to believe.
Right, and John, can we just talk briefly a little bit about the sort of unionist tactical voting that Lewis was giving us some examples of? Yeah. Are you surprised by that, about the sort of strength in certain seats, like Dumbarton, for example?
Surprised, no, though, of course, there is a deep paradox behind it. We know from the turnout is a record high for the Scottish Parliament. That voters in Scotland clearly care about the constitutional issue on both sides of the argument. And in a sense, the fact that voters on the unionist side of the argument have been willing to vote for whichever party is best placed to defeat the SNP gives the lie to the unionist argument during the campaign that what voters were most concerned about was the pandemic and recovery from the pandemic. It's the very fact that on the unionist side, voters decided the constitutional question mattered that may in the end have ensured that the SNP do not get an overall majority. There have been signs of this in the past, particularly of Conservative voters being willing to vote tactically, but it certainly does seem to have occurred on a much more substantial scale this time. And that, I think, is a reflection of the fact that Scotland, for the last 3 years, has been already engaged in quite a debate about whether or not there should be another referendum, and it is an issue that voters really, really think is an important one.
All right, well, before we talk about perhaps the only real bright spot for Labour in terms of these elections, which is Wales, let's talk about yesterday, reflect on that just for a moment. How bleak is it for Sir Keir Starmer when you take in the results so far in the English councils? We haven't had the mayoral contests yet, all of them in, and of course that Hartlepool by-election.
Well, let me give you the silver lining before I describe what I think is a fairly dark cloud for Labour. The silver lining is that when we project these results into the equivalent of the party's performance in a general election, Labour Party are 7 points behind rather than the 12 points that they were behind back in 2019. So I don't think we can say in terms of their position relative to the Conservatives that Labour are in as dire a position as they were in December 2019. And in truth, you know, the 7-point lead is roughly what you would expect given the national opinion polls. But then let's get to the cloud. Of course, what we normally expect in local elections is for the opposition to do well. These are usually occasions when the public give the government a kicking. And given that Labour's record in local elections under Jeremy Corbyn was exceedingly modest, it's rather embarrassment to see Keir Starmer that, frankly, he's just not put in a performance that's any better than many of those that were put in by Jeremy Corbyn. The second big part of the dark cloud is that it's perfectly clear that Labour's hopes that politics was going to return to the normality of left versus right, and that now that Brexit was done, Brexit was over and irrelevant electorally, that hope has not been substantiated.
Yes.
In truth, opinion polls have been telling us for months the Labour Party was not making particular ground amongst those who voted Leave, and this was then clearly indicated in the local elections as well as the Hartlepool by-election. Not that Labour is necessarily doing worse amongst Leave voters than it was in the general election. It's simply that because the results that we're seeing yesterday were for ballots last fought over in 2016 and 2017,
yes,
before much of the Leave losses by Labour were already in place. We're just seeing it repeated. But the point is, 2019 was not a one-off. Brexit has reshaped our politics, at least for the foreseeable future.
Right, well then finally, on the basis of what you've just said, John Curtis, and obviously these are an indication, these elections, and perhaps the first time since 2019 and the pandemic, of how the parties are doing and how people view the government's performance and opposition. But we would normally assume, wouldn't we, that the opposition would be doing better. They'd be making greater inroads. Where does Labour build a coalition of support that could win them a general election?
Well, there are various ways of answering that question. I mean, let's first of all deal with the Brexit divide. And in a sense, Labour seem to have decided that the only way back is try to reconnect with the pro-Leave working class voters that it lost in 2019. And the reason why it wants to do that is because representing that section of our society is how the Labour Party thinks of its raison d'etre. The reality that Labour faces, however, is that it's essentially a party that's backed by young voters, by graduates, by people who are relatively liberal on social issues like immigration. And if you look at the obstacles that Labour faced so far as winning a general election is concerned, yes, part of it is indeed that it's lost ground amongst Leave voters, but it's also that it's lost ground in Scotland, which is very strongly pro-Remain, and that also it's now got open to it a lot of targets in places like London that previously you wouldn't have regarded as available to the party. So it's not entirely obvious to me that the only way back is to ignore Brexit, as opposed to accept that Brexit is with us, to accept that Boris Johnson is going to pursue the pro-Leave argument, and that the only argument open for Labour is to pursue the Remain side. But I doubt if Sir Keir Starmer will take that advice. The other thing then is very simple, and it really doesn't matter whether it's a left-wing message or a right-wing message when it comes back to these traditional issues of the role of the government and inequality and all those things that Labour is much more comfortable talking about. What is crucial is that there is a message, and I think the problem is, and partly, of course, it is because of the pandemic, Sir Keir Starmer has not made it clear at all what Labour stand for. In the meantime, the problem Labour faces is that we do have a Conservative administration very unlike anything since 1979,
yes,
a Conservative administration that even before the pandemic was much more minded to intervene in the economy, so-called levelling up, etc., etc. And in the wake of the pandemic, that mood is only going to be reinforced, at least so far as the Prime Minister is concerned. So Labour's problem, therefore, is that a lot of its traditional territory is one that the Prime Minister is inclined to occupy, i.e. government intervention. And meanwhile, the Prime Minister is willing to fight the Brexit battle, whereas the Labour Party doesn't really want to be on that battlefield at all.
John Curtis, thank you very much, and maybe we'll speak to you again throughout the morning. We mentioned there that the bright spot for Labour so far is in Wales and in those elections to the Senedd. Mark Drakeford is set to remain as First Minister of Wales, where Labour, as I say, have performed strongly, winning exactly half of the 60 seats in the Senedd so far. Our Wales correspondent Thomas Morgan is in Cardiff. Thomas, bring us up to date.
Well, yeah, particularly bleak day here in Cardiff, but particularly bright day actually for Welsh Labour. As you say, that they've won 30 of the 60 seats in the Senedd, equalling their best ever record in Wales. They've always been in power since the Senedd was created over 2 decades ago, and look likely, well, they will be in government once again, really. Now, there's a number of reasons why they've done so well in Wales once again. I think the polls were showing they were due to be losing seats this time around, but there are a couple of factors which have proven that not to be the case. The first is Mark Drakeford himself. The recognition factor of the First Minister is higher than ever before. Never before has the Welsh public really recognised the First Minister, and I think the pandemic has really pushed him into the spotlight here. And also, I think people in Wales, on the whole, opinion polls suggest that he has done a better job than Boris Johnson, according to the Welsh public, of handling the pandemic and lockdown and restrictions. Secondly, back in 2016, in the last election, UKIP won 7 seats here. And that was only a few weeks before the EU referendum. And in the EU referendum, of course, Wales voted to leave the EU. So what's happened this time around is that UKIP vote seems to have been split evenly almost between Labour and the Conservatives, bumping up the Labour seats, and the Conservatives then picking up a couple of seats across the country, doing a little bit better, really. But they haven't been able to make the gains that we've seen over in England in the local elections. Here in Wales, they were really targeting the North East Red Wall seats up in the North East of Wales, but they've just made the one crack there, really, not really making any more ground there. Plaid Cymru, a bad day for them, really, losing former leader Leanne Wood in the Rhondda, not making any ground in any of their other seats. A few question marks over Adam Price's leadership. And the Liberal Democrats lost their only constituency seat. However, they did gain one on the regional, so they're in the same position as they were before. So I suppose the question really for now for Mark Drakeford will be, what does he do in terms of forming a government? He's only one shy. Will they just decide to go it alone as a minority government, as they are only one shy, or will they maybe look for their one seat somewhere, the ally of course being potentially Liberal Democrats, as they did in the last election? The argument from the Tories and Plaid Cymru as to why they haven't maybe done as well as they were expecting is because they say they haven't been able to get the traction against Mark Drakeford, who's been the First Minister in the pandemic and has had so much of the airtime, really, for obvious reasons, being the First Minister. However, Plaid Cymru especially may be thinking again whether or not it was the right time to really be pushing independence, because it's clear from the polls at least that, and the result, that they haven't been able to get the kind of growing sense of independence in Wales onto the ballot papers on Thursday, really. So we'll see what happens with that, but really a resounding and very strong day for Welsh Labour and for Mark Drakeford.
Well, as you say, stronger than they actually thought, Mark Drakeford and the Labour government there. In terms of forming their government, as you say, they're only one seat short. What's the sort of time frame, do you think, Thomas, before we'll actually find out how they will constitute it?
Well, it won't be a quick one. Welsh politics doesn't quite work on the same speed as it does in London, I'll tell you that for a start. Right. I think last time around it did take at least a week or so, but okay. Yeah, I'd be surprised, well, potentially by the end of the week at the earliest, I'd say. All
right, Thomas Morgan there in Cardiff, thank you very much, bringing us up to date there on what's going on in the Senedd, and a very strong showing there for Labour and Mark Drakeford in Wales. Let's get an overview of the election results across Britain so far. In Scotland, the ruling SNP's vote share has broadly held up, but it's failed to win a handful of crucial marginals. Boris Johnson has reiterated his opposition to another independence referendum, but the SNP leader, Nicola Sturgeon, says she will trigger one if she secures an outright victory, warning the Prime Minister he will have to go to court to stop her. More council election results are also due in England today, as well as those mayoral contests in London, Greater Manchester and the West Midlands. Counting is also continuing in elections to the Welsh Senedd. With this roundup, here's Greg Dawson.
Angus Robertson. They are results that determine not just the future of Scotland, but potentially the UK. There is no doubt the SNP is heading for a remarkable 4th consecutive term in power, but the indications are they may fall short of the overall majority that would strengthen the argument for another independence referendum. The Prime Minister isn't waiting for the final tally before having his say. In an interview in this morning's Daily Telegraph, Boris Johnson says now is not the time for another vote, describing the prospect as reckless.
The UK government's position is very clear on this. We don't think there's a case for another referendum, particularly now as we try to chart a way out of the pandemic and get our economy going again. But, you know, we will obviously deal with whatever we have to deal with once these elections are settled and once the new Scottish administration decides what it wants to do.
Even if the SNP do fall short, a pro-independence majority in Holyrood is still likely once the Scottish Greens are allocated regional lists later today.
Central to our manifesto commitment was the proposition of there being a referendum on independence during this parliamentary term. I'm confident that there will be a majority for such a proposition in the Scottish Parliament after the election.
In Wales, a touch of relief for Labour, who defied the opinion polls and looks set to stay in power after matching its best ever Senedd election result with exactly half of 60 seats in the Welsh Parliament. The Tories are in second place ahead of Plaid Cymru, with their former leader Leanne Wood losing her seat.
Congratulations.
For the Labour Party in England, the mood is more reflective after yesterday's dramatic loss in Hartlepool continued the trend of being trumped by the Conservatives in former heartland areas.
We have to ask ourselves why it is that people have not seen Labour as the answer to the problems they face in their everyday lives and the injustices we see. And that's my point about what's happened over the last 4 defeats in general elections, whether it's in Hartlepool, other places as well, where people do not now see Labour as answering those concerns.
There is the prospect of some relief later for Keir Starmer, with the results of the London, Greater Manchester and Bristol mayoralties expected to go Labour's way. Greg Dawson, BBC News, Westminster.
Right, well, let's return to the contest in Scotland and speak to our correspondent Alexandra Mackenzie at Holyrood. Now I'm looking into the right camera. Alexandra, tell us what's going on today and what we can expect.
Hi, Jo. Well, I think the big question today is going to be, can Nicola Sturgeon, can the SNP get that overall majority? It is looking very difficult, but at this stage, probably not impossible, and we'll know more later today. Not quite sure if we've got a time on that yet, but what we do know, or what we're expecting, is the SNP to be the largest party in Holyrood, just behind me here, and for Nicola Sturgeon to come back and be Scotland's First Minister. This would be their 4th term in government. Now, we're also expecting the Green Party to have enough votes in the Scottish Parliament for there to be a pro-independence majority. Now, the SNP would say that that would be enough of a mandate to push for a second independence referendum. Obviously, if they did have an overall majority, as they did in 2011, that would possibly give them more bargaining power with Boris Johnson. There was obviously a referendum in 2014 when they did have that overall majority, but Boris Johnson has said in the Telegraph today, as he has said time and time again, that he has no appetite for a second independence referendum. He has said it would be irresponsible and reckless, and said, let me leave it at that. But you can bet your bottom dollar the SNP will not be leaving it at that. Indeed, we heard from John Swinney earlier today on Breakfast, and he said that the people of Scotland have given emphatic support for another referendum, and that Boris Johnson should just accept democracy. Now, John Swinney has said that they will push ahead with legislation for that second referendum. So this is just a beginning of a new chapter of these discussions. There's definitely going to be political battles ahead and possibly legal battles ahead as well.
Alexandra Mackenzie at Holyrood, thank you very much for that update. We are actually expecting the result from the count in Aberdeenshire East at some point in the next half an hour or so. But first of all, let's take a closer look at the results in Scotland thus far. You can see there the state of the party, still 48 out of 129 seats declared. The SNP are up 3 on 39, and as we've been hearing from our guests and Alexandra Mackenzie too, it's not completely impossible, but it's looking unlikely that they will get an outright majority on their own, but there would be a pro-independence majority with the Greens at Holyrood by the time all the votes are counted. And then, of course, we will get the big constitutional question. The Liberal Democrats are on 4. The Conservatives are on 3 seats so far. Of course, we haven't had any of the regional list seats declared. They will be coming later on today. That is the proportional part of these Holyrood elections after the constituency ones. But they're down 2. The Conservatives, the SNP, have taken those. Labour are on 2 and they have lost 1. As I say, we're 48 of the 129 declared so far. 65, of course, would give an outright majority, but this is for the SNP, but that is looking less likely. Let's talk to the co-leader of the Scottish Greens, Lorna Slater. Hello to you, Lorna. We've been discussing these constitutional questions. You've heard from Boris Johnson already rejecting any calls for another independence referendum. What's your answer to him? Oh, a raise of the eyebrows.
Well, I think
saw.
Boris Johnson calling Boris Johnson calling other people reckless is sort of hilarious. I mean, the results are looking like what we expected, that with the Scottish Greens there will be a pro-independence majority in the Scottish Parliament, and we take that as a clear mandate from the Scottish people to hold another referendum.
Right, you say it's a clear mandate. Of course, it is. It's not a devolved issue. It is something that the UK government have to grant in the way that they did in 2014. Do you accept that if it ends up in the courts, that actually Boris Johnson is likely to win?
I don't know about the court process there. We're looking at it as a democratic process. The election or the referendum we had in 2014 was granted by David Cameron because he saw that there was a clear democratic mandate for it. And there'll be another clear democratic mandate this time. What kind of country are we if we ignore that kind of democratic mandate anyway?
Right. I mean, we've heard from John Curtis, who is our elections and polling expert, saying that actually support is broadly split, that Scotland is a divided country when it comes to the constitutional issue. Are you sure 50% of the people in Scotland have voted there will thank you for wanting to embark on yet more arguments around the Constitution when we're still not through this pandemic?
Well, I think we want to have that discussion about who's making the decisions about how we recover from this pandemic. Do we want it to be Boris Johnson's Brexiteers in London, or do we want it to be a Scottish government that we have elected here? And I think it's absolutely worth going back to the people to ask the question. During the last independence referendum, we managed to campaign and drive support for independence from 27% all the way to 45%. You're exactly right. It's drifted up to about 50% now. With campaigning and with laying out a clear vision for how an independent Scotland would work, we can definitely drive that higher. But I think Boris Johnson doesn't want a referendum because he knows he's going to lose.
Right, well, that may well be. But for you, as the co-leader of the Green Party, aren't there more important issues for those people supporting you on things like climate change and the environment ahead of the constitutional issue?
Of course, the climate emergency has got to be everyone's #1 priority, but this isn't an either-or question. Scottish independence would give us more tools, more of the, at the moment we don't have the devolved powers to do everything we can about climate change. We don't have devolved powers to lay subsea cables. We don't have the devolved powers to stop subsidies to the oil and gas industry and to even manage our own taxation system properly. Those are exactly the tools we need to deal with climate change and to tackle the climate emergency. And I frankly don't trust Westminster to use those wisely.
Right. I mean, Lorna, what about the timing? When would you like that referendum to be a second independence referendum if it does ever come about?
So in our manifesto, we've called for it during this term of Parliament. For myself, I think that needs to be once we're past the COVID pandemic so that it's safe. Obviously, we can't put anyone in danger, but we do want to campaign properly, get on doorsteps and have a national conversation about what kind of Scotland we want to build.
Right. I mean, you say that it will be during the first term when the pandemic is over, but that could go on for years, Lorna. I mean, the long tail of this pandemic, even if the restrictions are basically lifted, you do accept that this could go on for a very long time.
Well, we've had a very successful election campaign just now. We weren't able to do the full sort of campaigning that we would have liked to have done, but with the vaccination program and people getting used to social distancing and embedding these things in our culture, I think we probably can run a successful campaign for independence. We just need to find the right timing so that we can get that balance right.
Right, and it would be, again, I know all the results aren't in, and I know you can't obviously predict the future in that sense, but when would you, do you think, start talks with the SNP, with Nicola Sturgeon, in terms of that pro-independence majority, very much like the last Parliament?
Well, of course, we are expecting the SNP to be the largest party in Scottish Parliament, so I would say it would be up to them to initiate that sort of discussion because they will be running all the committees and all the business of Parliament. So we will see when they want to start it. It'll be certainly on our agenda, but it's only part of what we're looking at. We, of course, feel that there are some urgent issues around a just transition, around investment in renewable energy and investment in upgrading our railroads and so on to deal with the climate emergency. So we'll be focusing on those issues.
Right, and Lorna, is that what you're going to try and extract, if you like, from, as you say, what will be the SNP government as the largest party again, the sort of priorities that you want to pursue?
Absolutely. We would always try and push the SNP government to be greener and fairer, more progressive policies. The kind of things that we're particularly concerned about are fair funding for councils, a just transition away from oil and gas, phasing out oil and gas, land reform, better protections for wildlife. These are the kind of things that we'll be working for.
Lorna Slater, co-leader of the Greens in Scotland, thank you very much for joining us there outside Holyrood. Now, Labour will also be hoping to win the mayoral contests in London, Greater Manchester and the West Midlands today after they lost the Hartlepool by-election and they ceded control of several councils in England. The party's leader, Sir Keir Starmer, has said the defeats are bitterly disappointing and show he has to set out a stronger case to the country. Our political correspondent, Ian Watson, is in Westminster. Ian, what are those discussions going to look like? A lot of internal wrangling within Labour today.
Yes, no surprise there's a lot of internal wrangling, Jo, is there, in Labour. So we've already had, for example, one of the candidates to succeed Len McCluskey as General Secretary for the Unite Union, somebody who's on the left like Len McCluskey, saying that Labour is no longer talking to workers, it needs more socialism, it needs more policies, and it also needs to step up its attack on the government. But there are others at this stage, many of them beneath the surface, suggesting that the party has to move even further away from the Corbyn era, that Keir Starmer has to take sides, that he shouldn't be pursuing unity. He should be making it very clear that Labour has changed. Peter Mandelson, of course, the former Labour Cabinet Minister, said much the same thing on the record yesterday as well, and pointed out that Tony Blair was the only person who was able to deliver 3 successive Labour victories. So those debates are going on at the moment. We would expect some better results for Labour later on today in Greater Manchester, for example, and here in London. Nonetheless, in terms of where they need to be, they're a long way off, and the results were even worse than they were predicting, worse than their internal polling was telling them. So, for example, this morning, the Conservatives, for the first time, are getting seats on Rotherham Council in Yorkshire. So the scale of Labour's challenge is huge. In terms of responding to it, well, there's going to be a review of their policies. And I think what is going to be interesting, the details are going to emerge in the next few weeks, but what is interesting about that process, I think, is that it will give Keir Starmer an opportunity not just to move away from the 2019 manifesto, in which Labour lost very badly at the general election, but also some of the pledges that he made when he was standing to be a Labour leader, which were designed to appeal to the left of the party. And I'm also told there's going to be major organisational changes in the Labour Party as well. Rather like the BBC, they're going to be moving more staff out of London into the regions, the areas where they've been losing seats, and they're going to be reviewing their data and polling operations as well.
All right, some upheaval there. Ian Watson staying put, though, I think, for the moment, in Westminster. Joining me now to talk about all of that from Norwich is the Labour MP, Clive Lewis. Clive, good to talk to you. What's gone wrong?
Hi, Jo. Well, how long have you got?
Well, a few minutes.
How long have you got me today?
A good few minutes. You try me.
Well,
I mean, I'm listening to Ian there, and I'm listening to the kind of, the sound of deck chairs being scraped along the deck of the Titanic. Reject 2019, move to the right. Let's just take that for example. Let's move back to the centre ground of British politics.
Clive,
where is the centre ground of British politics?
Hold that thought. I did say you'd have a few more minutes. We're going to Aberdeenshire East for a count result.
Gillian Ann Martin, Scottish National Party, SNP, 18,307. Stuart White, Scottish Conservative and Unionist Party, 16,418. Conrad James Wood, Scottish Liberal Democrats, 3,396. Give a total number of valid votes of 41,155. We had 134 votes rejected, 1 for a lack of official mark or unique identifying mark, 13 for voting for more than one candidate, 1 for writing or mark by which the voter could be identified, and 119 unmarked or void for uncertainty. The following candidate is duly elected to serve as a member of the Scottish Parliament for the Aberdeenshire East constituency. That is Gillian Ann Martin for the Scottish National Party, SNP. I now invite Gillian Ann Martin to come and make some comments. Thank you.
So that is the result from the count there for the Scottish Parliament at Aberdeenshire East. And you will have heard there, and now you can see on our screens, the SNP candidate returned, Gillian Martin, as the MSP there for that constituency. It's an SNP hold. And there she was on 18,307. Let's just go back there and see if we can catch a little bit of her speech.
Years for you, at a very important time for the people of Aberdeenshire, who face the crisis of the pandemic, the situation with oil and gas, and the situation that we have found ourselves in where our young people need our help more than ever. I'm there for you, I'm going to work hard for you, and I'm going to make sure that when we transition to net zero, as we have to do, that Aberdeenshire East and the North East is at the very heart of all those plans. I've got some thanks to say. I want to thank, first of all, the counting staff and Aberdeenshire Council for everything that they've done the past couple of days. We were all a wee bit tired. Last night was not one in which I slept. But thank you to Jim and Martin and the police and all the people who are the counting staff. My election agent, Duncan Gill, gets special thanks. He has worked his socks off, not just as my election agent, but as my caseworker for the last 5 years. And I want to also thank my constituency staff, who work so hard behind the scenes. This win is not just Gillian Martin, it's the constituency staff of Aberdeenshire East, Gwyneth, Kenny, Duncan and Niamh. My family, I want to thank them. We've had a pretty tough year, and they are the most amazing people I know. They've supported me, and we've all supported each other through this very tough time. I would not be here without any of them. And my dad, Willie, is here today at the count, and I certainly wouldn't be here without him. We in our movement talk about the giants on whose shoulders we stand. People like me winning elections is because of the people.
We're going to leave that there. That's the victory speech there from the SNP candidate. Gillian Martin, now MSP, returned as MSP. Quite an emotional speech, and thank you to her staff and her family. Let's return to Clive Lewis, the Labour MP, just as he's sipping his cup of tea or cup of coffee. You were in the middle of a great flourish there. I'm sorry about that, Clive. If you can return us to that point, please, in terms of the dilemma for Labour.
I think, listening to your correspondent before talk about what's coming out from his sources, this moving away from the 2019 manifesto. But what are we going to go back to? The 2017 manifesto, where arguably our vote picked up in Hartlepool and other seats across the north, beyond even that which had been achieved under both Ed Miliband and Gordon Brown. So, I think this notion of the middle ground, that if we shift to the right, what is the middle ground? The middle ground of British politics doesn't exist. It's created. Boris Johnson's proving that at the moment. His party is spending billions of pounds, arguably on green infrastructure, challenging the climate crisis.
Yeah.
Where is the centre ground of British politics? You create it yourself, and that's what I think Keir and the team need to do. Put out that vision, make sure, look at the world's problems, look at the country's problems, and then produce policy from that. We'll talk mythical place in the centre.
Well, it's not working at the moment, certainly in parts of the Red Wall, formerly known as the Red Wall strongholds of Labour in Hartlepool, and no doubt there'll be a lot of discussion about it. Is he in trouble, Keir Starmer?
I think. Look, in terms of Keir Starmer himself personally, that's for Keir Starmer to answer. I don't know anything that's going on in terms of he's in trouble. We're all in trouble. And actually, it's not just the Labour Party that's in trouble. Progressives across, non-Tory political parties are in trouble because, if you look at the electoral system, we're fragmented. You look at the way the vote is splitting, we're fragmented. And ultimately, the Tories have, they are a hegemonic force in first past the post politics.
Right.
So,
but on that,
we've got to sort that out.
Yeah, but facing up to the realities of, all right, as you see it, the electoral system, has the realignment of British politics that some saw perhaps as temporary when it came to first the Brexit referendum, then the 2019 election, where you lost so many seats. Do you think that realignment of British politics is now permanent, that it is fractured in a way that is going to, for the foreseeable future, keep disadvantaging Labour?
The Tories are going to do their best.
Well, it's not just about what the Tories are doing; it's about your response.
But obviously, the Tories are going to do their best to make sure that happens. Incumbency gives them benefits, and that's going to be a problem for us. And it's possible. I can't predict the future, but what I can say is that there has been a long-term trend that's been happening, not just in 2019, not just in 2017. It goes back further than that. It's been happening for decades. Yeah. But ultimately, post-2008, the Tory party has been the first to in this kind of post-neoliberal consensus period, has been the first to reorganise itself and capitalise on the changes to demographics and the voting system that we have. And they're smashing us.
Right.
Basically.
Well, they're smashing you. OK. Clive Lewis, do you think strategically it was wrong to assume that Brexit was done and that actually the Labour Party needed to embrace Brexit for these elections, needed to say not only do we accept the result, but actually we need to embrace it in order to make those connections with your former heartlands?
Be authentic. I can't say anything more than that. So look, be authentic. If it's what you believe, then say it. And I think ultimately, look, make the case that that's what needs to happen, and explain why you're doing it, and then go out and set out your vision. Look, Brexit has happened. We're now outside of the European Union. There are problems of being outside of the European Union, which this government are failing on economically and politically. And we should make sure that we talk about those and that we hammer them where we can on them, because they are weaknesses for the Conservative Party, rather than ignore them because they're not politically convenient to this kind of perception that we have of voters in the foundation seats. I think we just have to be authentic and say what we think, and say what actually we believe is happening, why these things are happening. So it's not just about saying, do they want to hear this? I think this kind of politics by focus group, by what you think people want to hear, go out and make the argument. Stand by your principles and your vision and your values for the world, and go out there and argue them. Don't just say, well, what do you think?
OK.
Maybe we,
We've only got a minute or so left, Clive. Peter Mandelson, former Cabinet Minister, architect of New Labour and obviously former MP of Hartlepool, said it's the long shadow of Corbyn that has cast really doubt over the Labour Party and Sir Keir Starmer. Is he right?
I think he's part of the problem. If his answer is that we now lurch to the right, this is a man who couldn't tell mushy peas from guacamole. I'm not taking lessons from Peter Mandelson. Look, he's got something to contribute, no doubt, to the Labour Party. If it's constructive, I'll listen to it. If it's simply about kicking the left as an answer to show the world, to show the country that we're serious about power, please, no. I haven't got time for that.
OK, well, that's Clive Lewis there, Labour MP in Norwich. Thank you very much. Good to talk to you. That's the reaction, obviously, from the Labour Party of the results so far. We are hoping to have some of the mayoral election results later today. And, of course, we'll keep you up to date with what's going on in Scotland. Now, it's time for a look at the weather. Let's go over to Owen. This is BBC News. I'm Jo Coburn. The headlines. Counting continues as results come in from elections held across England, Scotland and Wales. The SNP gains seats in Scotland, but its hopes of securing an overall majority remain on a knife edge. The Deputy First Minister says they will push for another referendum.
There will be a majority of members elected to the Scottish Parliament who will be committed to the hosting of an independence referendum. That's a fundamental democratic point. That's what the people of Scotland will have voted for.
Labour performs strongly in Wales, matching its best ever Senedd election result. The Conservatives continue to make significant gains in England after their by-election win in Hartlepool. Results of regional mayor contests are expected today. Good morning and welcome to BBC News. Counting has resumed in counts across Britain. In Scotland, the SNP are on course to win their fourth term in power, but Nicola Sturgeon admitted the prospect of an overall outright majority in Holyrood is on a knife edge. The Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, has repeated that he would reject any calls for a second independence referendum. Let's take a look at the state of play in Scotland. We can have a look at the seats. Of course, we just had one announced, which has improved the SNP's tally. That was in Aberdeenshire East just before the hour. So they are now on 40. That was a hold, but they've gained 3 seats. The Lib Dems are still on 4. The rest looks pretty much the same. The Conservatives are on 3, down 2. And Labour is on 2, down 1. We will, of course, have more results throughout the day, particularly on the list seats. Mark Drakeford's Welsh Labour is set to remain in power after matching its best ever Senedd election results. Let's take a look at the results in Wales so far. Labour are currently on 30 seats, up 1. Conservatives are the second largest party, up 4. And Plaid are on 9. They're down 1 seat. They lost the seat in Rhondda. That was their former leader, Leanne Wood. And across England, the results of mayoral contests in London, Greater Manchester and the West Midlands are expected today. Labour, of course, is hoping to win them after losing the critical Hartlepool by-election yesterday and ceding control of key councils in England. Let's have a look again at the change in councillors across England. You can see there the 4 parties. Boris Johnson up 159. Keir Starmer is down in terms of council seats, 197, so a few more have declared while we've been on air. Down 26 for Sir Ed Davies' Liberal Democrats, and the Greens have gained a few in the last half an hour or so. They are up 54. Of course, counting has resumed across councils and in Scotland and Wales. We'll have the latest from across the UK in just a moment. But first, let's go to Glasgow and get the latest on the situation in Scotland with BBC Scotland's political editor, Glenn Campbell. Glenn.
Well, the election is far from over in Scotland. There are another 25 constituencies to declare today, and all of the 56 regional list seats across Scotland. And that could change the picture that you've been looking at so far. Yes, there is a sea of yellow across the political map in Scotland, and ultimately the SNP are on course to win a 4th term in office. There's a big question over whether they do that as they did in the last Parliament and govern as a minority with support for their key proposal of independence from a party like the Greens, or whether they might still just be able to finish with an overall majority in the Scottish Parliament, boosting their mandate to call for another independence referendum. But we know that call in all circumstances will be resisted by the UK government, with Boris Johnson arguing in the last 24 hours that now is not the time to hold a vote of that sort. He thinks that would be reckless. Actually, on that point, he's in agreement with the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, because she said she will put tackling COVID first, but she does want to hold that vote at some point in the course of the next 5 years. Whether or not that will happen, we don't know, but I think we can be fairly sure there is going to be a big constitutional clash between the Scottish Parliament and Government and the UK Parliament and Government over this in the next few years.
Sure, isn't it? Glenn, we've been speaking to Lorna Slater, co-leader of the Greens in Scotland, and got her reaction to what Boris Johnson has been saying, as you have outlined. Has there been any SNP reaction to the Prime Minister setting out in the Telegraph today, again, that he will reject any call for a second independence referendum?
Well, the SNP and indeed the Greens have factored that into their calculations. They expect there to be that resistance, and much of the debate over the last few years has been about what would they do in those circumstances, and the SNP's plan is to go ahead with the referendum bill that they've already published in draft form, to introduce that in the Scottish Parliament, and with the support of the Greens, if not the other parties in the Parliament who are all opposed to another independence referendum, they would expect to get that through. What happens then if they don't have the agreement of the UK government? Well, at that point, it would be an option for the UK government to refer that legislation to the courts for an adjudication, because the Constitution of the UK is a matter reserved to the United Kingdom government. They might think that Holyrood had overstepped its powers in that area. The Scottish government thinks that it could defend that legislation in court, but ultimately it might be judges who decide whether a vote of that sort goes ahead or not.
Right, Glenn, and just finally, John Curtis, our polling expert, has been talking about the fact that voters are broadly split on the constitutional issue when all the votes have been counted, and looking at the polls over, the last few months or so. Take us through a little bit the unionist tactical voting to keep the SNP out in certain counts and areas of Scotland.
Well, there has been tactical voting in this election. It's been very evident. If you take Scotland's capital city, for instance, in a seat like Edinburgh Central, where the SNP's former leader at Westminster, Angus Robertson, won the seat from the Conservatives, the SNP were the beneficiaries there. They seemed to corral voters to his cause. But in other seats in the city, like Edinburgh Southern, where Labour were defending, the party's voters who traditionally support other parties that are in favour of the union backed Labour in bigger numbers this time to strengthen their hold in that seat, and it was a similar picture for the Liberal Democrats in Edinburgh Western. So more seats in Scotland now are polarised between two parties, the SNP and the party best placed either to defeat them or to challenge them next time around. On the question of independence, the country is more or less split down the middle.
Right, Glenn Campbell, thank you very much for joining us there from Scotland. I'm sure we will return to you later on in the programme. Now, joining me now is the Conservative MP for North East Derbyshire and Deputy Chairman of the Conservative Party, Lee Rowley. Lee, welcome to you. It's an impressive feat, isn't it, if we just stick with Scotland for the moment, because we've been talking about it. The SNP are on course for a fourth consecutive term. Boris Johnson, though, is already writing in the newspapers saying he's going to reject any call for a second independence referendum. How can they do that?
Well, my party, the Conservative and Unionist Party, has been very clear about what its view is on the union, how important we think the union is, and nothing has changed on that, and how successful the union has been in recent weeks and months with the vaccination rollout and things like that. So it's not really news that the Conservatives are not keen on a referendum. I think in terms of specifically the Scottish election, I think we just need to wait until more of the results are coming in. We just had one a few minutes ago. I was just watching your channel from Aberdeenshire East, where the SNP's majority has been cut by 2/3. So it is a complicated situation. I think we need to wait to see where we are at the end of that. But it's quite clear that my party is not in favour of a referendum, has fought hard against one, has been very clear about its position on it.
Right, but you know that the SNP, who even if they don't actually get an outright majority, which is what triggered David Cameron to allow and give permission for an independence referendum in 2014, they will have a pro-independence majority, or they are most likely to, with the Greens, and we've spoken to them. So it is about denying the democratic mandate as they see it, when they've published very clearly in both their manifestos, the SNP and the Greens, that over the next term of Parliament, they want to hold a second independence referendum. We know what your view is, but how can you deny them that mandate?
Well, the SNP were also very clear in 2014 that they accepted that the referendum would be a once-in-a-generation referendum, but they continue to return to the constitutional question when the actual bread and butter issues that they should be focusing on have not improved in Scotland in the last 10 years or so. So I think what the SNP say and what they do don't necessarily always match up. But this is obviously a delicate and a sensitive question. And whilst I recognise that we are waiting for more results, I do think we need to get those results and see where it is. But the Conservative Party has a position, as I say, and we're not likely to move away from that position, given the importance of the union has been a central part of the party's plan for many decades.
Right, Eva, are you never going to move away from it? I mean, obviously that's your position for now. Are you saying that you will not move away from that position of denying what looks like an SNP government in terms of that second independence referendum? Is it forever?
Well, the role I'm in, I don't make policy about Scotland, but I know what the Prime Minister has said, and the Prime Minister has been clear about his view that another referendum would be reckless, and the Scottish Conservative Party's view that that is something which would not be advantageous to the Scotland as a whole. And so I think let's just see where we are at the end of the day and tomorrow when all come in. But, you know, that there is absolutely been clear progress made by the Conservatives, not just in Scotland, but across the country as a whole. And I think we have to reflect on where we are. But, you know, Conservative Party is clear about the Scottish referendum question.
Right. We're just going to stick one more on Scotland. We will talk about the other results, Lee, I promise you. Boris Johnson did say, though, that he was ruling it out, a second independence referendum, or allowing it in the current context. Does that mean that once the pandemic is over, and I'm speaking broadly here because it could have a long tail, that the government will reconsider?
I mean, Jo, I can only repeat what I've said a moment ago. I don't have any particular personal insight into this. I don't make policy for Scotland, but the Prime Minister has been very clear on media and in television, in his writings, that he is not supportive of another referendum. The SNP said it would be a once-in-a-generation referendum in 2014. They agreed with that proposition, and we think they should stick with it.
All right, and we'll probably be talking to the SNP soon. Let's talk about the results in England. Certainly a stunning victory for the Conservatives when it came to both the Hartlepool by-election and Tees Valley in terms of the mayoral contest, the directly elected mayor. People may be asking, though, Lee, when are they actually going to see some tangible differences, results from this levelling up agenda? Because as I understand it, the white paper isn't going to come out on this until the autumn. Why are you making people wait so long?
Well, we have absolutely made some good progress in the last few days as a result for the results that have come in so far. And I was extremely pleased to see the votes of confidence and endorsement in people like Ben Houchin in Tees Valley. You had the most extraordinary result, over 70% of the vote, the fantastic response from the voters of Hartlepool for the plan of Jill Mortimer.
But that's because they're waiting. That's because they want to see those promises that have been made to them turn into a reality. I mean, are you going to disappoint them, Lee, if you're going to wait and wait until the autumn to even publish a sort of white paper?
I think the voters of Tees Valley have already seen demonstrable change from Ben Houchin. I mean, I represent a red wall seat myself, North East Derbyshire.
Yes.
And in the past 4 years, we have seen some great opportunities come to North East Derbyshire. We have 2 town deals which we can use to regenerate and improve our local towns, which will be transformative for the local area. We have the potential to reopen another railway station, which has been a number of railway stations which have been closed for 60 years. We have some real movement on some congestion issues. So, you know, and that is reflected all across the country in terms of MPs who are trying to make the case for improvements in their constituencies and a government who is trying to make sure that we see demonstrable benefits as a result of what they're doing. Right.
So why is it taking so long to set out a broad white paper? You've just put in charge, well, not you, I should say, the government has put in charge Neil O'Brien, your colleague, to look at this. What's he going to be doing? What's holding him back?
I don't think there's anything holding back. I mean, Neil is a fantastic asset to the Conservative Party, and he is going to bring some great thinking around the levelling up agenda. But the levelling up agenda is already there. It's already demonstrating. I can already show my constituents as an example what we are doing to improve their lives on a daily basis. Now, I look forward to the white paper when it comes later in the year, but in terms of seeing the transformation on the ground, I can see it in my constituency and I can see it in other constituencies that my colleagues represent. And that's what we need to do. Focus on what we can change now, which is happening, and then also broaden it out, which is what Neil and the government is going to do as a result of the white paper that's coming later in the year.
Lee Rowley, Deputy Chair of the Conservative Party, thank you very much for joining me today. Now, what are we going to do? Our political correspondent, David Wallace-Lockhart, joins me now from Glasgow. David, hello to you. Good morning. Do take it away.
Jo, here's where things currently sit here in Scotland. The SNP are on 40 seats. The Lib Dems are on 4. The Conservatives have 3, Labour have 2, and the Greens have no seats. But let's remember, the majority of Tory, Labour and Green seats will come with the regional list results in Scotland later today. So here's how our results look on our constituency maps. Lots of SNP yellow, but an outright SNP majority hangs in the balance. The path to that looks narrow, but they've made 3 key gains so far that mean they're getting close. Let's look first at Edinburgh Central. It was Conservative, but former SNP Westminster leader Angus Robertson has been returned with quite a healthy majority. Let's cross now to the other side of the country, where the SNP managed to snatch the constituency of Ayr, also from the Tories. Just 170 votes in it, but a key gain for the SNP, who have unseated a Conservative MSP who'd held that seat for 20 years. Let's cross to the east of Scotland, to East Lothian, just to the east of the capital, Edinburgh. The SNP secured a seat here that's been Labour since devolution in 1999. Another great result for them. But other hopeful gains never materialised for the SNP. And one example is Dumbarton. So this was Scotland's most marginal constituency, with Labour holding it last time by just 109 votes. Labour increased their majority this time to almost 1,500. And it's interesting here to have a look at what happened with vote share. Conservatives down by 6%, Labour up by 6%. This isn't the only seat where it appears some tactical voting happened to keep the SNP out. Looking forward to results today. If the SNP is to get a majority, it's hard to see how they do it without winning this key seat, Aberdeenshire West. It was a Conservative majority of just 900 votes last time. Tory incumbent Alexander Burnett will be hoping to cling on against Fergus Much of the SNP. And if we look here in the atrium of BBC Scotland, we've got a hex map, and this shows every seat in Scotland represented as being the same size. That Aberdeenshire West seat could be key. If the SNP turn the centre yellow, a majority looks possible. If it fills in blue, the SNP may fall just short when the regional list seats are announced. And these list seats will be announced later today. 56 of Holyrood's 129 seats are regional list seats. And this is where we should see the bulk of Conservative, Labour and Green MSPs returned by the quirks of the voting system. And it's probably difficult for the SNP to deliver many seats via the list, given their constituency performance.
Thank you very much for that. We've just spoken to the Deputy Chair of the Conservative Party, Lee Rowley, and he is echoing what Boris Johnson has said again today about rejecting any calls for a second independence referendum. We haven't yet heard any official response yet from the SNP, but does it look as if we are going to be in legal arguments for the next few years at least?
Well, an important thing to point out, I think, Jo, is that we're not expecting the SNP, when it looks like it will form the next Scottish Government, to immediately start asking for an independence referendum. Nicola Sturgeon has been clear that she wants to deal with the pandemic in Scotland first, and when she thinks the time is right, she will ask for that. Now, regardless of SNP majority or not, the Greens will get enough seats, we suspect, so that there will be a pro-independence majority in the Scottish Parliament. So when that question is put to the UK Government, which could be years down the line, but when that request is put for that Section 30 order, which would allow Scotland to hold an independence referendum, if the answer from Boris Johnson at that point is still now is not the time, I think we can expect to see that potentially go to the courts and a legal argument to play out about who exactly has the power to hold an independence referendum in Scotland. Where does that power lie? Is it Holyrood? Is it Westminster?
David Wallace-Lockhart, thank you very much for that. With me now is Shona Craven, community editor at The National, and she's joined by Kevin Haigh, chairman of the pro-union think tank These Islands. Welcome to both of you. Shona, can I just start with you on the issue of timing, as I was just talking to David about? Do you agree that actually there'll be a pro-independence majority, that's most likely, at Holyrood, but Nicola Sturgeon won't be in any rush to go for permission for that second independence referendum?
Well, I think we have to bear in mind that the timescales involved here, are considerable from the asking point and then potentially the legal wrangling that might follow until the vote. And I believe she hopes to hold the referendum within the first half of the parliamentary term. So I don't think there would necessarily be a long period of inactivity. And obviously it does depend to some extent on how things go with the pandemic. She won't want to be seen as dragging her feet, but she will also be looking very closely at the polls, because of course she doesn't want to push for a referendum that she's not confident that the yes side will win. Right. Kevin, what's your response?
Well, I mean, I agree with Shona's last point, which is she won't want to push for a referendum which she won't win. And so, in fact, I think, there's going to be a bit of a phony war now around the right to hold another referendum, because that's the fight that Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP want. Because she will sound like nobody as much as Theresa May in the coming months, I suggest, by repeating that now is not the time, because now is not the time to hold a referendum. There isn't demand for a referendum from the people in Scotland now, and were that referendum to be held, it would be lost by the yes side at the moment. But the interesting point, I think, is that whilst the pandemic is the excuse given for not wanting a referendum now, the truth is that Nicola Sturgeon will not want a referendum until she's able to answer questions which she couldn't answer during this campaign. Questions about borders, questions about currency, and questions about the inevitable austerity that would follow breaking Scotland out of the United Kingdom. And until she can answer those questions, she has no interest in another referendum. All she is interested in is having a fight with Westminster over the right to hold a referendum, because that fuels further grievance.
Right. Shona, do you think that's true? She has been called cautious. Obviously, you will have heard Alex Salmond, former First Minister, saying there needs to be more urgency around the push for a second independence referendum. Is it, as Kevin is suggesting, actually it's just convenient to continue with a phony war, because those issues around border, around currency, are just too difficult to answer?
Well, it's certainly a topsy-turvy situation to sort of feel like we're hearing Alex Salmond talking points coming from Kevin there. I think there are conspiracy theories too far. Some people now believe, it's all a big ruse and her entire political life has been a lie and Nicola Sturgeon doesn't want independence. I think that's nonsense. I think part of the reason we've not had a full debate about the independence question is because that's not actually what we were deciding at this election. This is about having the right to a say again on the independence question. Now, there are many issues that will arise as part of a campaign, and I think from now, whether the Section 30 is requested or not, now is the starting point to get into that again and to get back to those issues, which of course Alex Salmond himself arguably didn't have the answers for back in 2014. The situation has changed significantly. We're out of the EU for a start. So the whole landscape has changed. And I think actually Boris Johnson has made a huge tactical error by coming out in the Telegraph today and saying this isn't the time. I assumed he would try to misrepresent the situation as being that only if the SNP achieved a majority would there be a mandate. We have had mandate upon mandate upon mandate. So we need to stop moving the goalposts. But I suppose I'm grateful to Boris Johnson for not creating that false scenario whereby only an SNP majority, which is extremely difficult to achieve and was a huge achievement when they did achieve it, that can't be the only threshold or the new thresholds that's created for this mandate for people having the right to the say. This isn't about declaring independence later today if there's a majority for the...
Oh, you've just frozen there. Kevin, I'll let you respond. You were smiling all the way through that.
I find it very amusing that we hear words about, now's the time to start, or, we don't... the Yes campaign, the SNP, the Nationalists, don't have answers which are palatable to the Scottish public when it comes to the question of borders, when it comes to the question of currency, and when it comes to the question of austerity, the balance of tax and spending. And in fact, what they are reduced to is persuading their supporters that the Scottish government's official statistics aren't true. I mean, these islands, we did some polling on this very recently, which showed that the majority of supporters of independence believe that the Scottish government's own national accounts are made up to disguise Scotland's true wealth. Now, if support for independence relies on that level of fact denial, it will not survive a campaign. And you certainly can't write a credible prospectus on that basis, which is why no credible prospectus exists. After 14 years of SNP rule, campaigning purely for independence, Nicola Sturgeon wakes up every day, and yes, she cares about the pandemic, but she cares about it through the prism of what furthers the cause of independence. And yet, as we've seen in the preceding few weeks, she cannot answer questions on borders, she cannot answer questions on currency, and she cannot answer questions on austerity.
Shona?
Well, the figures that are being referred to there, the government expenditure and revenue statistics, are estimates for a start. And so when you're talking about something being true or false, it's a little bit simplistic. You actually have to analyse the details properly. And also those figures tell us nothing about, if you'll just let me finish, what the figures don't tell you is how an independent Scotland would fare. And if indeed Scotland is uniquely incapable of being independent and running its own affairs, which what we haven't actually heard answers from, you're saying we've not heard answers from Nicola Sturgeon. What we've not actually heard from the UK government is any case for the union. And actually, as the polls have shown in recent times, I don't think it is a guarantee that if there was a referendum tomorrow, it would be lost. This is a very fluid situation. Obviously, the handling of the pandemic has been a disaster internationally, and Scottish people are aware of that. And so there are a lot of different things to weigh up here, including, yes, estimated figures, notional deficits, but there's a lot more education about these issues than there was, I would say, in 2014. People are looking into this, and to just dismiss the Scottish public as stupid and ill-informed and imply they shouldn't have the right to choose because they'll make the wrong decision, I don't think that's very democratic.
Kevin?
I mean, none of those are words that I used, of course, and this is fairly typical sort of straw manning from the nationalists. Nobody is saying that the Scottish government's numbers are historical, actual numbers of the current constitutional situation. Of course, that is true. Of course, that would change under independence. Nobody is saying that Scotland is uniquely incapable of being independent. Again, that is a nationalist straw man. What we are asking the nationalists to do is to be honest with the people of Scotland about the implications of Scotland becoming independent. And those implications are very real when it comes to economics, when it comes to tax and spend, when it comes to public services, when it comes to people's pensions and mortgages. And they are the questions which the nationalists have continued to avoid answering. And until they answer those questions, they will not be able to make a case for independence.
Right, but Kevin, if that's the case, if you're so confident about the economics, as you have clearly set out, and the big questions that you say the SNP and Nicola Sturgeon has to answer, why not have that battle? Why not have that independence referendum campaign? And if you're that confident that they wouldn't win in the next couple of years, then throw down the gauntlet and support it and make your case for the union.
I mean, to be honest, I think there's a case for doing that. The problem here is, and it's the one thing that both sides agree on, is now is not the time. So the idea that whilst we're dealing with Brexit, whilst we're dealing with a pandemic, that we should put this country through another divisive referendum, and the amount of political energy that would be dedicated to that when this country has so many more important issues to face. I don't think either Nicola Sturgeon or Boris Johnson thinks that's a good idea. So whilst it may be fun to sort of do the political game playing and say, actually call the SNP's bluff, okay, we'll have a referendum, school gates, 4 o'clock, it's on. Whilst, that might be a fun thing to sort of hypothesize about, the reality is that would drag this country through another divisive referendum and distract political resources and indeed financial resources away from where they should be focused right now, which is on recovery.
Right. Do you agree with that, Shona, that the priority should be elsewhere? You will know better than I will about the breakdown of polls in terms of support for independence around that issue of timing that we have been talking about. And I think it's only around 28%, correct me if I'm wrong, who say, yes, they'd like an independence referendum, but not within 2 years, or only 28% said they would like one within 2 years. Everybody else is sort of saying leave it longer. So actually there isn't quite the support there to do it in the timescale that you have talked about.
Well, I think it is really difficult to look at those figures in the current climate, because obviously people are saying, well, we don't know when the immediate threat of the pandemic will be over. So I think it's quite a difficult thing to ask people, you know, how long is a piece of string? How long is the crisis going to last? But I think it's important to point out there's been this suggestion that you can either have independence or recovery, and somehow as if the two things are divorced. And what I would say is, with regards to answering questions about how things are going to be, well, I'd like to hear some questions answered from the UK government about what austerity plans they have as part of their recovery and how that is justified, and whether we have to pay off all the debts that we've incurred from the pandemic, and whether that will happen by hitting those with the least the most, which is normally the Conservative way. So I think we need a lot of openness from both sides about exactly how they frame a recovery and who will be the winners and losers from the recovery. And if the pandemic's taught us anything, it's that we know who the Conservatives will be focusing on to make sure they're all right after the pandemic, whereas obviously what a lot of people who support Scottish independence want is a fairer society. And while this has been an awful year, there is opportunity here to do things differently. So the idea that recovery has to happen and we go back to the austerity UK status quo before we can make a change doesn't make sense to a lot of people. So I think the polling needs to be ongoing. I think people need to keep taking the temperature. And if you take the argument that it will be divisive and messy and, you know, a waste of money, maybe we should stop having elections altogether and just have Tory rule forever.
Oh, well, Kevin.
Well, sorry, just on the austerity point, I mean, the closest the SNP have come to actually being honest about the economic implications of separation was the Growth Commission report written by Andrew Wilson. That made very clear that what an independent Scotland would need to do is get its deficit under control by growing spending more slowly than GDP growth, i.e. by shrinking the size of the state. Now, any version of the numbers that you run on that, even before the pandemic, means that implies austerity, and it implies austerity far, far deeper than anything we would experience within the UK, for the very simple reason that Scotland spends more per capita. That's why Scotland currently receives fiscal transfer of about £10 billion a year, nearly £2,000 for every man, woman and child in Scotland. Now that's just simple economic facts. That's just the situation today. It's not what the situation tomorrow would be. And if Scotland was independent tomorrow, it wouldn't be receiving that money. And therefore Scotland tomorrow, independent, whilst trying to create its own currency, whilst dealing with the trade borders that it would be putting in place with its largest export market, would also need to be addressing that tax and spend imbalance. And that would mean austerity on steroids.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there, but thank you both very much for that very animated discussion. That is Shona Craven and Kevin Haigh there. Of course, there are regional mayoral results still to come across England. BBC Newsnight's policy editor Lewis Goodall is at the touchscreen now to take a look at them. Lewis.
Indeed, Jo. Obviously, the biggest of all of those regional mayor contests is what is happening in London. Now, we haven't spoken much during the course of this campaign, thinking about all of the different key battles on London, because it has been received wisdom that Sadiq Khan would walk the contest, not least because, of course, London very much is the Labour heartland these days, dominant in the capital. We haven't had all of the results in from the first round of counting. Londoners ranked their candidates into two. They have 2 votes effectively, and the first preferences are being counted now. 7 counting regions have come in, 7 still to come in. And what's actually really interesting about all of this is that we are starting to see some swings to the Conservative candidate, Sean Bailey. Let's have a look at Lambeth and Southwark. That is a Labour stronghold, if ever there were one, across the entire country. 2% swing from Labour to the Conservatives. North East London, a 5.5% swing from Labour to the Conservatives, from Khan to Bailey. In Brent and Harrow, which was a region of London that Sadiq Khan won back in 2016 when it was last contested, the mayoralty, that actually Sean Bailey has overtaken. The Conservatives have overtaken them on first preferences now. A 3.5% swing from Labour to Conservatives. But it's also also interesting to consider why that is, as you can see, in terms of, apart from Brent and Harrow, Labour way out ahead. But if we look at the changes in share, what's interesting about this, it's partly, yes, that Labour are doing quite a bit worse in each of these places, down 5% in Lambeth and Southwark, down 8% in the North East, down 6% for Labour in Brent and Harrow. Conservatives doing a bit better, apart from in Lambeth and Southwark. North East, 3%, 1% there. But look at the Greens. This is something that I think has been underreported in this campaign across the country, really. Greens doing quite a bit better across the country, and certainly in London against Labour. Up 3% in Lambeth, up 3% in the North East, up 2% in Brent and Harrow. Now, it is partly because the Greens are doing quite well that I suspect that when the second preferences are allocated, assuming that Sadiq Khan doesn't get over 50% of the vote in the first ballot, that Sadiq Khan will be safely over the line, because I suspect that many Green voters will have put Sadiq Khan in as their second preference. But nonetheless, an interesting element of this election is, as I say, the Green performance. If we turn to the London Assembly as well, no change in terms of the actual results there yet. But again, we can see in terms of the share of the vote for the London Assembly, again, Greens doing very well. Labour down by -1%, Conservatives up by 2%, the Greens up by 4%. So quite a strong performance for the Greens in London. And I think that will worry some in the Labour Party. You're already seeing some on the Labour left saying we're risking a splintering, not only on the right of the party to the Conservatives, but also potentially in the future to Greens, because of course when Greens get established in local areas in terms of getting a council seat here, a council seat there, then there could become a problem for Labour further down the line. Just looking at some of the other mayoral contests, most of them we haven't had in yet. We had Doncaster yesterday, pretty easy Labour hold. Liverpool was quite an interesting one, not because the result, well, we thought, again, a result wouldn't be in doubt. Labour absolutely dominant in Liverpool, of course, but there are particular circumstances around this campaign that viewers might be aware of. Corruption allegations with regards to the former mayor, Jo Anderson. The Labour candidate, Joanne Anderson, no relation, we're assured, did win the contest, but with the independent candidate really challenging very, very strongly, with Labour vote way down there at 39%. After the second preferences were reallocated, 59%, but generally a much weaker performance for Labour than we would expect in Liverpool. Obviously, the big contest yesterday, or the thing that got the most attention, was the Tees Valley. This was a really, really narrow result back in 2017. I think we can see the 2017 result for the Tees Valley. Look, it was in 2017, 39% Conservative, 39% Labour. Once the second preferences were reallocated, 51 to 49. Absolute knife-edge stuff. People didn't expect Ben Houchin to win then. But then you compare it to the result yesterday. My word, what a complete transformation that there's been in the Labour vote and the Conservative vote. 73% on the first round. Never mind a second preference. They didn't need it by any stretch of the imagination. 73%. You don't usually get that in democratic contests, never mind in Britain or anywhere in the world. 73%, up 33%, an enormous 23% swing from the Conservatives, from Labour to the Conservatives. And that's something I've really noticed in this campaign, as these results as well, Joe. The huge swings we're seeing. We don't normally see swings of this sort of type. It shows that politics really is becoming much more febrile and vociferous. Two interesting results still to come in for the rest of the day in terms of the mayoralties. The West of England contest down in the southwest of England, the West of England, I suppose, that's why it's called that. 27, the Labour Party does have some hopes for this campaign. There was, in the last couple of days, there were some hopes that maybe this could be one of the few Labour pickups we'll see. It was quite narrowly fought again back in 2017, 52% to 48%. We'll see what happens there. It's currently Conservative held. And then another really big one, the West Midlands contest, much like the Tees Valley contest in 2017. It was very narrowly fought between Andy Street and the then Labour candidate Sean Simon, former Labour MP for Birmingham Erdington, an MEP. After the second preferences were reallocated, again 50.4% to 49.6%. I don't think anyone in the Labour Party, realistically, given what we know about the results for the West Midlands and how dire they've been for the Labour Party, generally expects this to be anything close to being replicated again. I think the Conservatives think that they're going to have another pretty strong result for Andy Street in the West Midlands, and that he'll be comfortably returned as Labour Mayor for the West Midlands. And the fact that there is that hat-trick, the Hartlepool by-election, the Tees Valley mayoralty, probably the West Midlands mayoralty, we'll wait to see, but probably the West Midlands mayoralty, Conservatives will be very, very happy indeed. And if you'd said a few months ago that that would be the result of the Labour Party, they would have been very depressed, as indeed they are today.
Right, I'm sure they are. Lewis, thank you very much for taking us through all those mayoral contests. The West Midlands, as you say, is going to be particularly interesting because it is very tight there between Tories and Labour, Liam Byrne and Andy Street. And we'll get a little bit more of that later on. But for now, we're going to stick with the West of England. England and the mayoral contest there. Our correspondent Paul Baltrop is in Bristol, where counting is taking place. Over to you, Paul.
Yeah, they've been counting the votes here since 9 o'clock this morning, and there are about 5 different count venues across the west of England. We're expecting results sometime early this afternoon. Of course, that's if it goes through to the second round of counting, because you get 2 choices with this election. Now, as we said, this really was a target for Labour. Keir Starmer, their leader, came down here campaigning with their candidate 3 times. Dan Norris being the candidate, a former MP, he knows the area well. He used to represent the parliamentary seat currently occupied by Jacob Rees-Mogg. So Labour reckoned they had a good chance here. The Conservatives won it last time around, which was the first time it was up for contest in 2017. So the Conservatives are in essence the incumbents, albeit with a new candidate this time around. I've got to say, talking to people out there over the last day or so, talking to the parties, there's a sense that perhaps Labour haven't quite done enough, haven't quite got there, which of course would fit in with a pattern around the rest of the country. But one of the reasons why Labour have focused so hard here is because it's actually a double mayoral contest taking place in this part of the world, because as well as the regional mayor, we've got the city mayor for Bristol, and that's where Labour have done well in the last few years. The incumbent is Marvin Rees. He's been in for 5 years. The election was delayed from last year, and they're very much hoping he will be re-elected. Now, we're not going to know about that until very, very late tonight. They've got to get the West of England regional mayor done first, then there's going to be a break later. Then they're going to regather this evening and start counting. We expect a result sometime around midnight. But that is what has given Labour this hope, because they think with people in the city of Bristol, and this is a place where there are 4 Labour MPs, with them being encouraged to vote by lots of candidates, by the mayoral candidates and also by council candidates, they're hoping for an extra large turnout. That may be enough to get Marvin Rees re-elected. It may not be enough, though, perhaps, to see Labour take the West of England mayoral crown.
Baltrop there in Bristol, reminding us that there are 2 contests going on in that part of the country, the West of England mayoral contest and, of course, the Bristol City mayoral contest. And as he said, we'll get results later on. Let's get an overview of the election results in general across Britain so far. In Scotland, the ruling SNP's vote share has broadly held up, but it's failed to win a handful of crucial marginals. Boris Johnson has reiterated his opposition to another independence referendum, but the SNP leader Nicola Sturgeon says she will trigger one if she secures an outright victory, warning the Prime Minister he will have to go to court to stop her. Now, more council election results are also due in England today, as well as the mayoral contest we've just been talking about, but in London, Greater Manchester and that tight contest in the West Midlands. Counting is also continuing in elections to the Welsh Senedd, and with this roundup, here's Greg Dawson.
The counting is far from over, but the arguments about Scotland and the future of the Union are already underway. There is no doubt the SNP is heading for a 4th consecutive term in power, but the indications are they may fall short of the overall majority that would strengthen their argument for another independence referendum. In an interview in this morning's Daily Telegraph, Boris Johnson says now is not the time for another vote, describing the prospect as reckless.
The UK government's position is very clear on this. We don't think there's a case for another referendum, particularly now as we try to chart a way out of the pandemic and get our economy going again. But, you know, we will obviously deal with whatever we have to deal with once these elections are settled and once the new Scottish administration decides what it wants to do.
Even if the SNP do fall short, a pro-independence majority in Holyrood is still likely once the Scottish Greens are allocated regional lists later today.
Central to our manifesto commitment was the proposition of there being a referendum on independence during this parliamentary term. I'm confident that there will be a majority for such a proposition in the Scottish Parliament after the election.
In Wales, a touch of relief for Labour, who defied the opinion polls and look set to stay in power after matching its best ever Senedd election result with exactly half of 60 seats in the Welsh Parliament. The Tories are in second place ahead of Plaid Cymru, with their former leader Leanne Wood losing her seat.
Congratulations.
For the Labour Party in England, the mood is more reflective after yesterday's dramatic loss in Hartlepool continued the trend of being trumped by the Conservatives in former heartland areas.
We have to ask ourselves why it is The people have not seen Labour as the answer to the problems they face in their everyday lives and the injustices we see. And that's my point about what's happened over the last 4 defeats in general elections, whether it's in Hartlepool, other places as well, where people do not now see Labour as answering those concerns.
There is the prospect of some relief later for Keir Starmer, with the results of the London, Greater Manchester and Bristol mayoralties expected to go Labour's way. Greg Dawson, BBC News, Westminster.
Well, let's take a look at Labour's prospects. The party's suffered a bitterly disappointing by-election defeat in Hartlepool and lost a large number of council seats in England. Sir Keir Starmer has promised to lead a fight back and set out a bold vision for the future of Labour. But others are criticising what they see as a disappointing lack of policy aims. Well, joining me now to talk about all of this is Labour MP and Shadow Health Minister Alex Norris. Welcome to you, Alex. What do you think's gone wrong?
Well, this has been a challenging night. It was always going to be a challenging night for us. Its roots are, 18 months ago in our worst ever general election performance for 80 years. We've been on the road back from that, and I think there are signs of progress. However, what's gone wrong is we clearly haven't made enough progress. And it was clear from talking to voters that they were listening to us again, but they weren't yet convinced by what we had to say. So the answer to that is to accelerate our process of change and to connect better with voters with a vision that they want to buy into.
Right. I mean, Alex, accelerating a process of change, what does that actually mean in real layman's terms if you're a voter watching this?
Well, it means that you firstly, when you get a result as badly as we had in December 2019, you have to reflect on it. You have to listen to what people have said is wrong. So whether that was clearing the decks with the issues relating to anti-Semitism, whether that was the change in leadership that people were clearly telling us that they wanted. We've made steps like that along the way. What we clearly haven't done is give them an attractive enough policy offer that they at this moment think we buy into. Now, there is some criticism there was in your previous package about a lack of national policy. I think that's a little bit unfair. In England, these were local elections, and we had elections in Scotland and Wales. So rightly, our leadership in Scotland and Wales and on those local councils and those police and crime commissioners set out what I think were bold and very exciting agendas. And it was for them to do that. But now we'll be back more into a national political space, and we will see that leadership from us centrally, and and that's what we will be doing. Right.
You said you're going to promote or put forward an attractive policy offer, but just on the basis of what voters have seen, they obviously don't like it enough, particularly those voters in the northeast of England. I mean, you lost the Hartlepool by-election. The Tees Valley was retained by Ben Houchen, the Conservative, with a huge majority. Do you accept now that you've lost those former heartlands? You've just not got that connection to parts of the former Red Wall, like the North East?
No, I accept that we lost them on Thursday. I don't accept that they're lost forever.
Really?
What I know and what was clear from the conversations we've had and clear from the election results is that those communities want change and they don't think that we're the party to give it them. So that is a big problem. So now as we emerge in it, we're at this extraordinarily important national moment as we exit from coronavirus about what we want our country to be like. And for us, we will be convincing, we want to convince people in those communities and across the country that we have the compelling vision for what our country needs to look like in the future. And we failed on Thursday to do that, but I believe we'll be better in the future.
Right. Is one of the problems that Sir Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, I think we're going to be showing some pictures of him while we're talking about his leadership, that he and perhaps you and others in the Shadow Cabinet haven't really accepted the idea of Brexit. We were told by the Labour Party that it was time to move on, that Brexit had happened and it's time to move on. But the areas that we're talking about today, off the back of the results in Hartlepool and Tees Valley, they embraced Brexit. Does the Labour Party need to do the same?
I don't think so. I got no sense, in my constituency, which is a 64% Leave seat, I got no sense from all the knocking I did that people want to particularly keep relitigating Brexit and what happened. What they want now is coming out of this terrible national sacrifice we've had to make for the last year plus, coming out and through the Brexit process, for political parties to make the best of the situation that we're in, to build an optimistic future that meets their desires for them and their family. That's a very reasonable request. I think that goes much further than any one individual or collections of individuals. And, that is our challenge. It'd be dead easy to start pointing at one factor and then try and change it. Life's not that easy. Certainly in politics, it isn't. It's a much deeper thing. And that's, the journey that we're on. And clearly we haven't got there yet, which is why we have to go more quickly.
Right. But is it, it's a question of trust, though, isn't it, Alex? Because obviously Keir Starmer was a renowned Remainer at the time. And I'm not saying that we're reliving the arguments that were had before the Brexit referendum or even in the 2019 general election. But perhaps they feel that he's not in tune with what they think in those Leave areas, that he's not really understanding their concerns, and nor are you.
I personally just don't think that's the right analysis. I think there's clearly a correlation there, but I don't think it's a causation. And obviously people will make their own views on that, but I don't think that there's some sort of hangover legacy that people are making a judgment about Keir Starmer based on that. That hasn't been my experience at all, or our collective experience. There's a deeper issue with their connection to Labour's vision, but I don't think it's that one thing. Right.
Well, now, obviously, there have been a lot of senior people within the Labour Party offering advice. Some of it, I'm sure, not all wanted. But Peter Mandelson, former architect of New Labour, saying that this is the long shadow of Jeremy Corbyn. Do you agree with him?
I think that's overstating it. Whenever you have good or bad, frankly, election results, what you tend to see is a kind of rush to cameras. I'm not necessarily accusing Peter of this, but generally of people trying to fit whatever evidence there is to the conclusion that they'd already formed. That for us isn't our job. It'd be really easy to just point at someone else, that's not part of the current central team and blame it on them. Wouldn't that be easy? Actually, that's not what Keir Starmer's going to do. When I was on Newsnight on Thursday, I said that this would be a no excuses election for us, and that's what it is. We're not hiding behind excuses of other people. We're owning it. We're changing. We're going to do something about it.
Right. When can we see those changes? When will it happen? What sort of timescale are you giving yourself?
Well, we haven't got very long, have we? So this is an immediate process. It starts with a really root and branch. Keir's committed to a root and branch reform of our policy agenda. That's going to start straight away. There is no time to waste. We're right on it. We've heard the message strongly. The process in many senses had begun, but clearly has not gone far enough, and we're getting on with it now. Right.
In terms of any changes in personnel, would you want to see that happen? Would that make a difference, the shadow cabinet changing?
If it was as easy as that, if the answer was sack me and we'll win, then boy, I'd have my resignation on the desk in the next 30 seconds. Then those things will be a matter for Keir to decide as the leader. I don't think there's any quick fixes like that. Our route back to reconnecting with those communities is much deeper, much more based on values and trust and our policy agenda than anything around personalities. So for that sort of thing, you'll have to wait and see.
All right, Alex Norris, thank you there very much. Part of the Shadow Health team. Let's talk now. We're going to return to issues in Scotland and talk to the SNP's Kate Forbes, who has won the seat of Skye, Lochaber and Badenoch. Welcome to you and congratulations too.
Thank you.
With an increased majority, I understand. You will know, Kate, about Boris Johnson already saying he will reject any calls for a second independence referendum. So what are you going to do?
Well, 49 seats have been declared in Scotland, lots more still to be declared. And of those 49, the SNP have won 40, taking 3 off pro-union parties. The Conservatives, Boris Johnson leads them, have lost 2 and they have won an overall of 3. So Boris Johnson can say what he likes, but ultimately what we're seeing right now is the people of Scotland putting their trust and their faith in the manifesto that the SNP set out. Now, we need to wait and see what the overall seat will be in terms of the votes being cast and counted over the course of today. But I think it's quite clear that the people of Scotland know what they're voting for. And usually journalists are holding us to account for delivering on our manifesto. And as the biggest party, quite clearly off the back of this election, hopefully you will be holding us to account on our manifesto, which included an independence referendum.
Right, but you don't want an independence referendum right now, do you? You want to wait a little while until, as Nicola Sturgeon says, the pandemic is over and the recovery's begun. So your supporters who are desperate for a second independence referendum, they'll have to wait, won't they?
That's right, that we have said that the priority right now is steering the country through this crisis and emerging from the pandemic. We've said that our number one priority, as soon as we get back to our desks, is to continue to do that work. Many businesses are still in lockdown, and we want to ensure that, we manage the crisis well.
Right, so you agree with Boris Johnson on that? Not now. It's irresponsible to hold an independence referendum now, which is what he says in this context, and you agree?
I don't think that's what Boris Johnson is saying. I think what he's saying is...
He's just ruling it out, isn't he, for now, in this context? He said it would be irresponsible in the way that you've just said because of the crisis and the pandemic.
I think what he's saying is there will be no referendum because he's scared of the result. What we're saying is that our priority is managing the crisis, but it's important that the people of Scotland have another say over their long-term future. And I'd remind you that the Conservatives did campaign on a single issue, which was no to a second independence referendum. They have 3 seats to our 40. And I think that tells a story of its own.
Right, but do you agree with him that a referendum, a second independence referendum in the current context is irresponsible?
No, I don't agree with him. I think the number one priority is steering the country through this crisis. But when the crisis is over and in time for the Scottish Parliament to be equipped with all the powers it needs for recovery, we should put that question to the people of Scotland. At the end of the day, Boris Johnson and I will disagree on the rights and wrongs of independence, but surely we can agree on the fact that it should be a question that is put to the people of Scotland. That is the nature of democracy, and that's what we're arguing for right now. We're arguing for a mandate for another independence referendum, and ultimately it's for the people of Scotland to decide, not for any politician.
Right. I mean, Kate, according to the Institute of Government, under the Scotland Act 1998, the Scottish Parliament is not allowed to pass legislation relating to matters reserved to Westminster. It's widely interpreted to mean that any referendum relating to Scottish independence would require Westminster's approval. So the likelihood is that this will end up in the courts. Is that the right use of taxpayers' money in Scotland to end up in a legal battle that actually, on the basis of what I've just read out, Boris Johnson will probably win?
Well, I mean, I sincerely hope that it doesn't get anywhere near that because I believe in democracy. I'm a Democrat. I have just been re-elected because I'm a Democrat. So it is unsustainable for Boris Johnson to keep saying no.
But you would go to the courts. Nicola Sturgeon said you would. Well, she said if it was rejected, you would go to the courts if it ended in the courts. Just to be clear to your voters, you do think it's a responsible way to spend taxpayers' money?
If anything ended up in the courts, it was because Boris Johnson dragged us to the courts, not the other way round. And we have been quite clear that we believe in democracy. And right now, what we are seeing from some pro-unionists is that for Boris Johnson to keep saying no is ultimately anti-democratic. So I believe in democracy. Let's see democracy take its course over the course of today. And I hope ultimately when there is a pro-independence group of MSPs in the Scottish Parliament, we will be able to take that question back to the people. But right now, as you've rightly said, our priority is steering the country through the pandemic.
Right, and as Finance Secretary, you would be happy then to spend, I don't know how much it would cost, perhaps you could tell us, but you'd be prepared and happy to spend that money on that sort of argument if it came to it, because of course, as you say, an independence referendum was in your manifesto and that's what you will follow through at some point in the next Parliament.
I mean, you're putting words in my mouth and you're also putting the responsibility for this on the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government, when what we're saying is let's honour democracy, let's ensure that the people of Scotland get what they voted for.
No, but I'm just asking you a question. I'm not putting words into your mouth.
I know, but it's not a very good question right now.
Why?
When I'm believing in democracy. Because if anything ends up in the courts, it's because Boris Johnson took it there. So this is a question for the Conservatives who have just lost again in Scotland quite decisively. And we're saying let's put the question to the people. Let's pursue the democratic means of delivering on what people have voted for. And that is our strong preference.
Right. Do you also accept, Kate, that actually Nicola Sturgeon has said she wanted to hold an independence referendum in the first half of the next Parliament, so that would be in a couple of years' time. But actually the polls have indicated that there's only really support around 25 to 28% for that.
Well, I would hope that we have an independence referendum in time for the Scottish Government to be equipped with all the powers that we need for steering the country through recovery, because ultimately we face a choice right now. We are either lumbered with the Conservatives, whose ideology, whose approach hasn't changed since the 10 years of austerity we had post-2010. That is one alternative. The other is a recovery that is made in Scotland, that is shaped in Scotland.
All right.
And that's what I would like to see.
Kate, it's my fault. We've run out of time, but thank you very much for joining us. Now it's time for a look at the weather with Owen Wynne-Evans. This is BBC News. I'm Jo Coburn. The headlines. Counting continues as results come in from elections held across England, Scotland and Wales. The SNP gained seats in Scotland, but its hopes of securing an overall majority remain on a knife edge. The Deputy First Minister says they will push for another referendum.
There will be a majority of members elected to the Scottish Parliament who will be committed to the hosting of an independence referendum. That's a fundamental democratic point. That's what the people of Scotland will have voted for.
Labour performed strongly in Wales, matching its best ever Senedd election result. The Conservatives continue to make significant gains in England after their by-election win in Hartlepool. Results of regional mayoral contests are expected today. Good afternoon and welcome to BBC News. Counting is underway today in counts across Britain. In Scotland, the SNP are on course to win their fourth term in power. But Nicola Sturgeon admitted the prospect of an overall majority in Holyrood is on a knife edge. The Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, has repeated that he would reject any calls for a second independence referendum. Let's take a look at the state of play in Scotland. Well, if you look at the tally of seats there, you can see the SNP has gained, actually held another seat, bringing its tally to 40. That was Aberdeenshire East, so they are up 3. The Lib Dems are still on 4 and the Conservatives and Labour are still at the same place as they have been this morning. 3 for the Conservatives, they've dropped 2 and Labour are on 2, having dropped 1. So it's 49 out of the 129 seats declared. Many more, of course, for the lists later on today. Mark Drakeford's Welsh Labour is set to remain in power after matching its best ever Senedd election results. Let's take a look at the results in Wales so far. Labour are currently on 30 seats, up 1. Conservatives are the second largest party, up 4. And Plaid are on 9, down 1 seat. Haven't performed as strongly as they had hoped for. And across England, the results of mayoral contests in London, Greater Manchester and the West Midlands are expected today. Labour is hoping to win them after losing the crucial Hartlepool by-election yesterday and ceding control of councils in England. Let's have a look at the change in councillors across England. There you can see the party leaders. The Conservatives are up 158. Labour is down now by 206, a disappointing performance for Sir Keir Starmer. The Lib Dems are down 25 and the Greens are up 53. So that is the current tally of council seats for the parties. We'll have the latest from the UK, but first let's go to Westminster and speak to Chief Political Correspondent Adam Fleming. Adam, what should we look forward to later on today?
Hello again, Jo. Well, we've just had a result from Cannock Chase in the English local authority elections, which has gone from no overall control to Tory control, with Labour losing 9 councillors there. So that's repeating that pattern yesterday that we saw in lots of areas of England, where at this point in the cycle, you'd think the opposition up against the government who'd been in power for 11 years would be gaining seats. Labour are losing them, so just compounding the misery for Keir Starmer. Labour will be hoping that things will become a little bit less miserable throughout the day when they get results from places where they're expected to do well in the mayoral elections, like Manchester, Bristol and London, although it will be interesting to see whether the opposition parties in those cities have nibbled away at Labour's vote, and so even the victories end up being a little bit disappointing as well. And then, of course, the massive picture from Scotland, which will dominate the political conversation for the next few months.
Yes, it's been dominating my conversation, certainly, this morning. Adam, if we just take a step back and look so far, I know that we haven't got the full picture, and you're absolutely right. We're going to get those results from those key mayoral contests, which possibly will lend a bit of brighter light for Labour, doing obviously and have done very well in Wales. But when you look back at the UK, you can see that Boris Johnson's Conservatives in the ascendancy so far in those English Council results and that by-election in Hartlepool, Labour in Wales and in London, and the SNP, certainly the largest party in Scotland. Difficult to see, isn't it, how any one party is sort of prevailing over the whole of the UK?
Yes, although, I mean, I think yesterday the lesson we got from England was that the Conservatives and Boris Johnson have hit on a real winning formula, and it's the winning formula that they used in 2019, the combination of Brexit and promises of lots of spending wrapped up in Boris Johnson's optimistic, levelling up, bouncy persona, and that seemed to work really well in Hartlepool yesterday and seemed to have worked in the English council elections in other parts of the country. And the fact that Labour are now finding themselves fighting yet again another massive internal battle about whether to go to the left, stick to the centre or tack a little bit to the right. And we know that Labour, one of their responses to their terrible showing yesterday is to have a policy review. Our colleague Ian Watson is finding out that policy review is going to take quite some time.
Yes.
And also it could be quite a divisive process because it's an opportunity for lots of Keir Starmer's internal critics to say, keep hold of these policies that Jeremy Corbyn had that you don't like. And then the people on the other side of the argument saying, no, we need a radical overhaul of what we're offering the British public. And as long as Keir Starmer is trying to win that argument internally, that's less time for him to win the argument with the rest of the country.
Right. I mean, the Conservatives, obviously, in Boris Johnson's government have got a headache, haven't they, potentially, with any call for another independence referendum. That is going to be the big issue that he has to potentially deal with. And you've said that he's written today that he's going to reject any call for that. And Alex Norris from the Shadow Health team, from Sir Keir Starmer's team, is saying, listen, we haven't had enough time to make the progress that we needed to because of that shocking election result in 2019. I mean, starting with that, Adam, do you think that's fair that they haven't had enough time yet?
Do you know what, Jo? Actually, I'm going to pick up on something else you just said there, which is the headache, if that's okay, I hope you don't mind, which is that metaphor of a headache for Boris Johnson being posed by the Scottish Parliament result. And I think that is actually a very good metaphor. And let me expand on that. So today, there will probably be a majority in the Scottish Parliament for another independence referendum. It will not be a majority for the SNP. They'll have to rely probably on the Scottish Greens for the majority for the cause. Now, Boris Johnson can today say, no, now is not the time for an independence referendum. I'm not going to let you have one. It's bad timing. So that's like kind of taking a paracetamol for the headache. But guess what? The symptoms will come back, because then Nicola Sturgeon in her manifesto says she will try and seek negotiations with the UK government for her to have the power to hold a referendum in future. Boris Johnson can say no, pop another paracetamol, that headache will go away for a while. But then, as you've been discussing all morning, the SNP say they'll pass legislation at Holyrood to hold their own referendum, which then the UK government would probably have to challenge at the Supreme Court. 2 paracetamol, and then what happens to the headache after that? Does it go away after all those painkillers, or does Nicola Sturgeon just keep finding ways to get at Boris Johnson over this? Right, well, I'm loving the headache metaphor. Thank you very much, Adam Fleming there in Westminster, bringing us up to date with the picture and the scene across the UK. We talked about the mayoral contests. We are waiting for a few key results later on today. I don't think they will come in the next hour, but let's get a bit of a preview, because we can talk to Elizabeth Glinker, who is at West Midlands. There she is. Hello, Elizabeth. Tell us, how tight is this going to be?
Very, very tight indeed, Jo, or at least actually at the moment Labour are hoping it's going to be tight. Last time fewer than 4,000 votes in it. This time, you can probably see behind me now, this is the count for Birmingham, so there's another 6 counts like this going on across the West Midlands conurbation. They've sort of finished first preferences here, and it was such a bad day for Labour in the region yesterday, right across the Black Country. Of course, these are the same areas that are voting in the mayoral race, that there's real concern that Labour don't make it past first preferences. So actually, in the first instance, if they do manage to get to second preferences in this race, then they will actually be quite pleased. It's been a very unusual race here in the West Midlands. To begin with, Andy Street, the Conservative candidate, distancing himself somewhat from the government in Westminster, wanting to sort of show that space between himself and them. But actually, as the race has gone on and the Conservatives pushing ahead in the polls, it's really become that messaging from Andy Street's team around the fact that he has contacts at number 10, he's the one that can pull in investment, very similar to the arguments that we've seen rehearsed in the northeast of England. That seems to have been playing very strongly here in the West Midlands. And Liam Byrne's camp, I mean, increasingly worried, chatting to them yesterday, I think really heads were down. As I say, they're very concerned now about getting past first preferences.
It's a very crucial count, really, and a very crucial mayoral contest, because Labour had really set their sights on it in the way that you have just outlined. How big a blow will that be, not just to the Labour team there under Liam Byrne, former cabinet minister, but broadly to Sir Keir Starmer?
I think a huge blow, because as you say, you know, the Black Country, the West Midlands, part of that red wall that collapsed so spectacularly in 2019. And it had been hoped that Liam Byrne, a strong candidate on paper, as you say, a former cabinet minister under Gordon Brown, could push back here. And this could be a sign that Keir Starmer's leadership was really working and winning people round in those communities. But looking at the results in the council elections yesterday, that hasn't really come through. And a little bit of local detail for you. You know, the real base of the vote for Labour in the West Midlands now is in Birmingham, metropolitan Birmingham. 9 of the 11 MPs in the city are Labour. But Birmingham didn't have council elections on Thursday, unlike the rest of the region. So that isn't going to boost their turnout. And the turnout for Labour in Birmingham was absolutely critical to them making headway in this race. So a real challenge for them. And I think it will be of huge disappointment, not just to the candidate, but of course to the Labour leadership as well. I mean, Keir Starmer has been here on a number of occasions during this campaign. And I think it was notable that on the last day of campaigning, he wasn't in the northeast. He was here because there was a feeling that they could still get this one. But talking to people around the team yesterday, there's now, I mean, they're not holding out much hope, I think, would be the way of phrasing it.
You may have said it, and if you have, I apologise. The timetable, when do you think we might get a result?
OK, so as you can probably see behind me, it looks like they've stopped counting for the Birmingham count, so they've done first preferences here. We are, of course, waiting for the other 6 boroughs to count their first preferences as well. Now, we had been expecting about 2:30 this afternoon, but given what's happening here, we're thinking it might be slightly earlier, so we're thinking now maybe 1:30.
Oh, right, OK. Oh, that's good. That must be one of the first places we're going to get an earlier result rather than a later one then, because obviously...
I've said that now, so that's the kiss of death.
A hostage to fortune.
But, you know, we think...
OK, Elizabeth Glinker there in the West Midlands following that mayoral contest, which sounds like it is becoming extremely interesting and possibly tight. Labour's leader Sir Keir Starmer has said the defeat in Hartlepool in the by-election there and in some English councils are bitterly disappointing and show he has to set out a stronger case to the country. But what can Labour learn from these elections and how the future strategy should be set? Well, with me to discuss that is Paul Mason from The New Statesman, and I'm also joined by John Rentoul, Chief Political Commentator at The Independent. Welcome to both of you. Paul, it's been incredibly disappointing so far, apart from Wales, admittedly, but incredibly disappointing for Labour so far in terms of the English council results, the Hartlepool by-election and in Tees Valley. What's gone wrong?
Well, what's gone wrong is that politics has become about values. And there's a whole bunch of people in politics, many of them in senior positions in the Labour Party, who can't get their heads around this. Jeremy Corbyn had a problem getting his head around it. He used to go and say, look, things are the same for you as if you're in Middlesbrough or in Lambeth, and they're not. Because people have started to vote according to identity. There's no greater example of that than what's happening in Scotland, where the Scottish Greens and the SNP are about to form a radical independence-prone government. The identity was a big thing in Hartlepool. I'm certain it's a big thing out there. Elizabeth Glinker's talking about the Black Country. I know that place well. I'm certain that people are saying, well, now our identity is represented by conservatism. What went wrong is that Labour should have understood that that was the lesson of the 2019 election and put in place the only thing you can do when faced with divergent identities, and that is a single offer, a single project that can bring everybody back around, as it were, one hymn sheet.
Okay.
And so I think it's very clear what's gone wrong. Right. They've luxuriated in 18 months or 14 months worth of time wasting, but for obvious reasons, because they can't agree what the project is.
Right. Well, of course, that is a problem. John, you were looking sceptical then.
A bit sceptical, yes. I mean, I think Keir Starmer has done a heroic job in his first year as Labour leader in trying to get the party back on track. But as he rightly says, the damage suffered to its reputation is so great that it's going to take a long time. And at the moment, the government's doing extremely well with the vaccine rollout, and so Boris Johnson is popular. I mean, I think there is a bit of a myth that's already taken hold after the Hartlepool by-election that Labour is going backwards from its 2019 election result. It's not. No. If you look at what the BBC John Curtis's projection of equivalent national vote share would have been from the local elections, Labour's closed the gap to 6 points on the Conservatives. It was 12 points behind in the general election. So that's half the way made already. Right.
But do you have to accept that parts of the northeast, have they gone forever, Paul? Do you think that, I mean, this sort of realignment that we've always talked about, post-Brexit and post the sort of 2019 general election, is that now permanent? Is that in place and Labour needs to rethink where it gets its support from?
I certainly think it needs to rethink a lot of things, but I don't think it's permanent. Nothing's permanent in politics in any case, as you know. But if you look at the low turnout, so 15,000 people voted Tory, 7,000 people voted for Labour. These are tiny figures. Where I am in Lambeth, I've just been looking at my local result, which is out for the mayoral election. 90-odd thousand people voted in a similar, and it's fairly small chunk of London.
Right, but so, Paul, are they just piling up votes where they already know they've got them in the bag?
No, they are. This is not the point I'm making. This is, of course, Labour's problem. It's piling up votes in the cities. But the point I'm making is that more people stayed at home in Hartlepool than bought the Tory prospectus.
Okay.
And I don't disagree with John that there have been incremental changes made by Labour that will begin to attract the people back. But what they will not come back to is vacuity. They will not come back to a sort of PR kind of flag-waving thing with no content. By all means, wave the flag. I'm not hostile to that. But let's have some content of what Labour policy is. I don't think policy wins elections. Stories win elections. But you can't tell a story unless there is a beginning, a middle, and an end. And something to talk about.
John?
Absolutely. No, I always knew Paul was a Blairite, really.
That'll be news to him.
There is a realignment going on in politics. I mean, there's a huge realignment. We've seen it in these results that Labour is becoming the graduate professional party of the southern middle class, and the Tories are becoming the working class party. It is a remarkable thing, but demography is not destiny, and if you had to choose between those, I would, you would say that the graduate professional classes are likely to be more numerous in future. It's just that Boris Johnson has been extremely effective at welding together an electoral coalition of in a way, contradictory elements. But I mean, that's politics. He's good at it, and Keir Starmer isn't yet.
Right, isn't yet. But you think he could win the election, the next general election, John?
Oh, absolutely. As I say, he's got halfway there already, despite everyone talking gloom and doom about how Labour can never win again. I mean, Labour only has to match the Tories for vote share in a general election, and obviously getting a majority is a huge demand. But to be prime minister in a hung parliament is not that difficult. To deprive the Conservatives of power is perfectly possible, and I can see Keir Starmer doing that.
Right, Paul, can you?
No, absolutely. I backed him in the leadership election, but I think there are. I'm not so complacent about this, and nor of course am I any kind of Blairite. I think, look, the danger is that this is not rock bottom. Whatever you say about vote share and projections, there are big things happening. You've been talking about one all day. The potential independence of Scotland from the United Kingdom. That would finish any prospect of a majority Labour government.
Yeah.
The other thing is that politics doesn't stand still. Johnson and the people behind him are on a roll, and the offer made to them, let's put it very crudely, is, and you heard it there with the West Midlands race, is that my mate is the Prime Minister. He has some money. If you vote for me, our town will get money.
Yeah.
This is retail politics. This is the new conservatism, as long as the central bank and the Treasury go on churning out the money. Right. Now, I don't think that's so easy to fight unless you've got a vision of the future. We're not managing a stable capitalism. We're managing a crisis-prone system, and one in which there are many losers. Incidentally, where I am, Lambeth and Southwark, which has just voted overwhelmingly for Sadiq Khan, is where the working class exists. This is the new working class.
Yes.
They're not all graduates. They're not all sort of Royal Opera attendees. These are people who live on council estates, and what are they? Solidly Labour with the second preference Green. And I would be just as worried about that if I was Starmer as I am about Hartlepool and places like it.
Right. Well, that's interesting that you think he should be concerned certainly about both those. Are there enough votes there, though, John, to win? I mean, if you look at Scotland, obviously it used to be a heartland for Labour. It isn't anymore. And actually, perhaps we can talk a little bit about Anas Sarwar, the newish leader there, and how well he's doing. So personally, he seems to be doing better than his predecessor from a low bar. But I don't think it's going to translate, by the looks of it, into seats. But can Labour win with that new coalition of voters that Paul's just set out?
Well, yes, it can, but obviously losing Scotland makes it harder. And, yeah. Anas Sarwar is a very impressive figure. And in fact, I mean, what's remarkable about him is he's almost the only person you could imagine doing a better job than Keir Starmer as Labour leader. I mean, the talent, I'm afraid, in the shadow cabinet and in Parliament, and even people are talking about Andy Burnham or Sadiq Khan as a possible Labour leader. I mean, the talent, I'm afraid, is very thin. Anas Sarwar is possibly the best that the Labour Party has got, and yet even he can't turn it around in Scotland. But I wouldn't to go along with Paul Mason's doom and gloom about if you can't get Labour votes in Scotland, then Labour can never win. I mean, Tony Blair won in England. It can be done, and it just requires the right politics, assembling the right coalition, and that includes the Greens, as Paul said.
Do you think there's any challenge, Paul? I know we've spoken about this before, any challenge coming in from the left at some point, because there will be the group of Socialist Labour MPs who will think it's because Keir Starmer, as you said at the beginning, hasn't been really clear about the direction that he's following. Would he do better if he had a clearer economic prospectus that is firmly to the left, despite the fact that the Tories under Boris Johnson, of course, have had the biggest state intervention because they've had to for the pandemic?
I don't call Joe Biden left-wing in any way, shape or form, but if he simply echoed Biden, he'd be pledging something like 200 billion of extra borrowing and spending that the Tories won't be going in, because we know what the spending plans are out to 2024. So what I want him to do is not left or right. It's simply save the planet with a big investment program. And I don't want to wait for months for a policy review. They know what Biden is doing. They know that sets the bar for all of the left and social democratic parties. Do it. I think that the challenge, no, I mean, when I speak about these things, I'm not speaking conjecturally. I know fairly deep in an intimate way where the left is in the PLP. There is no challenge whatsoever coming against Starmer from either the left or the left trade unions. I mean, it's utterly clear. They're not united even around the same things. Many are Lexiteers. Many, like me, have been ardent opponents of Brexit. You wouldn't even get to first base. The problem comes for Keir if he can't make this work in the next... See, we've got a conference coming up.
Yeah.
He has to stand up at that conference and have answers. He's never even been in a meeting with the membership yet. And I really think that he's got to get on the front foot now, not sort of in some mythical, distant back end of this year.
Right. I mean, how much time, though, do you think he actually has? I mean, I spoke to one of the Shadow Cabinet Health team, Alex Norris, who can't just, they're going to do this policy review. Paul's talking about the conference coming up. And still the party's talking to itself, John, isn't it?
Yes, I'm afraid that's what the Labour Party's best at. That's what it's most comfortable at doing. But as Paul says, I mean, in a way, this is very bad for Keir Starmer, that he doesn't have any challenge. There isn't an obvious alternative to his leadership. I mean, anyone who thinks that Rebecca Long-Bailey would have been the answer, I don't think is persisting with that view. Although you must think that Lisa Nandy might have done a better job with some of holding some of those northern seats. But I mean, I think Keir Starmer's problem is that he doesn't feel threatened by an alternative leader, and the Labour Party doesn't really feel threatened by an alternative party that's seeking to take its place. I mean, in that sense, the Labour Party could just retreat to its comfort zone and stay in permanent opposition, which is what it always wants to do, unless a true leader comes along and shakes it out a bit.
Right. I mean, we've seen the sort of divide, Paul, played out on our screens yesterday following Hartlepool's result. Unsurprisingly, Peter Mandelson used to be the MP there and former cabinet minister saying this is the long shadow of Jeremy Corbyn. And then we had Len McCluskey, who was a very big supporter, still is, I'm sure, of Jeremy Corbyn, saying pretty well the opposite. I mean, that is a problem, that tension continuing. Who's right, Paul, in your mind?
Well, look, I certainly don't think this. As a Corbynista, I've been very critical of the last period of Jeremy's leadership. But I don't think it's that. I think it's something. It's a deeper thing. And of course, just to explain to viewers, the reason why the Labour Party has arguments between ourselves is that we're a mass democratic party. I feel utterly empowered to have my say in the future of this party, and I will have it. I pay my money, and I intend to have my vote. So look, I think the arguments, the danger with the arguments is that there's a kind of excuse machine. Either it was Keir's fault, or it was somebody's fault who was the campaign coordinator, or they chose the wrong day. These don't get to the core of the issue. Politics is the solution is no longer, hey, everybody's poor, everybody's a worker, therefore you have common interests.
Yeah.
They don't perceive that anymore. Labour's got to say something that cuts through, that tells a narrative.
Yes, but that connection, John, and the narrative that Paul is talking about, that connection with parts of the country like the North East. I mean, I know we keep going to the North East, but that's where we've had those results in Tees Valley and Hartlepool. I mean, is there a sense, Alex Norris dismissed my suggestion that actually they just don't see Keir Starmer as talking to them, as really understanding why they voted for Brexit, why they then have made the move to vote for the Conservatives. I mean, do you think that is still there, that problem that Keir Starmer and the Labour Party say they accept the result, but did they need to really embrace it and say, yes, we really understand you?
Well, that's very difficult, though, isn't it? Because, anyone who really cares about Brexit, for example, knows that Keir Starmer fought extremely hard to try and reverse the result of that referendum. They see him as a London lawyer.
Yeah, but that's a problem, isn't it?
Well, it is a very fundamental problem, but it's not. It isn't an absolute bar to Labour winning elections, because there are plenty of
reconnecting with those sorts of communities, because Labour has repeatedly gone on and on about the connections with former strongholds. Should they give it up?
Well, yeah. I mean, you could say, well, Labour should just abandon the Leave voting working class and concentrate on winning votes of graduate professionals in urban areas. I mean, there is an awful lot of them, and they could win elections on that basis. But the problem is that the Labour Party thinks it exists for the working class. I think it needs to decide where it stands on that.
All right, very briefly before we go, and I'll let you both go. Thank you, Paul.
I think that it's, of course, we can't abandon those communities that have some 200 years of existence into building a labour movement. But the labour movement's always a line drawn through a community. It's always it's an invitation. Stand on this side in solidarity with each other and with people not like you, or be a Tory, to be honest. And I think there is a moral battle to be had inside those communities. And I want Labour to be picking MP candidates now who are prepared to have that battle. No more bland technocratic people chosen to go up face to face, toe to toe with right-wing populists. We've got to have the battle.
Thank you both. Thank you both for your time. I'm sure we'll all speak again soon. Now, counting is underway again to decide the makeup of the next Scottish Parliament at Holyrood, with the possibility of an SNP majority on a knife edge. The results of the Aberdeen South and North Kincardine election will be announced shortly. Let's go live now to our reporter David Shanks, who's at a count in Aberdeen. Over to you, David.
Well, yes, as you say, we've had one count, Aberdeenshire East, expecting Aberdeen South and North Kincardine pretty soon. That first count, Aberdeenshire East, saw Gillian Martin return to Holyrood, but with a reduced majority, 6,000 down to just under 2,000. We saw what we've seen in all of the declarations so far. Before, we've had an increase in the turnout, which has seen an increased share for the Conservatives. And where that really matters is in the neighbouring seat that we're going to see later on, Aberdeenshire West. Now, that could be a key seat for the SNP's hopes of a majority in this election. So there, the SNP's Fergus Much is hoping to flip a majority of just 900 votes from the Conservatives' Alexander Burnett. Now, if we see an increase in turnout, the SNP really need that to swing in the opposite direction to where it has across the rest of the country. So it could be a really tough race. We're expecting that one late afternoon, 4 or 5 o'clock though.
All right, we've got more results obviously coming in as we speak, and results, they're key results, as David was saying, up in Scotland later on this afternoon. Thank you very much for joining us. Now, Mark Drakeford is set to remain as First Minister of Wales, where Labour has performed strongly, winning half of the 60 seats in the Senedd so far. BBC Newsnight's policy editor, Lewis Goodall, is at the touchscreen now for more. Lewis.
Yes, indeed, Jo. Let's really focus on this in the sense that Mark Drakeford's performance, really shouldn't mince our words about this, has been absolutely remarkable in many senses. Welsh Labour's performance, so different by comparison to what has been happening in England. They're now going to have their 5th term of office in the Senedd, and indeed, it looks like, well, indeed, they've already increased their representation on the previous Parliament. 30 seats, basically already at the halfway point, the magical point they need in order to get a working majority. Technically, it's 31, but because of the presiding officer, all they need is 30. Conservatives, good night for them as well, up by 4 seats, 12 seats there. Very disappointing night there, I think, for Plaid Cymru. Down 1 seat, currently on 9. That will go up when we get a few more list seats, but nonetheless, a disappointing night for them. Clear, I think the Conservatives are going to be second in the Senedd. The Lib Dems, they're going to have 1 seat. They've lost their 1 seat their one constituency seat, I should say, sorry, in Brecon and Radnorshire. She was Kirsty Williams, that was the Welsh Education Secretary, in a coalition of sorts with the Labour government in Wales. Very lopsided coalition because there was only 1 member of it. Would have been a bit of a sad day for Welsh liberalism if the party of Lloyd George had no seats in the Welsh Senedd, but they are going to have 1. And UKIP down 4, did very well in the 2016 results, but lost all of their seats now. And you can see here in terms of the constituency share, Labour up 5%, Conservatives up 5%, Plaid Cymru down 0.3. The Abolish Party, which some people thought might get some seats in this election on the regional list, they're about 4%, but it doesn't look like they'll probably have enough. The Abolish the Assembly Party, as they call themselves, but of course now it is the Welsh Senedd. And how did Labour achieve this? Well, they achieved it very, very interestingly by keeping hold of some of the seats that they lost, that Welsh Labour lost to the Conservatives at the 2019 general election. We talk so much, don't we, Jo, about the Red Wall? Well, there was in England. Well, there was a Red Wall in Wales as well, up in North East Wales, where a whole clutch of seats, be it Delyn or the Vale of Clwyd or Wrexham went to the Conservatives, some for the first time in the 2019 general election. Well, this time, apart from the Vale of Clwyd, it was a different story. If we look at Delyn, for example, as I say, in northeast Wales, let's have a look at what happened there. Hannah Blithyn returned as the member there in Delyn, 48% of the vote. It wasn't that the Conservatives did badly, they actually gained 9% of the vote, but Labour added 8% to their total, so more than enough to retain a very healthy majority of 3,711. And what's really interesting about this, Jo, I think, is that it's the same pattern to some extent as we've seen in England. UKIP vote collapsed. They're a completely nugatory force, gone now in British politics. But their vote share didn't exclusively go to the Conservative Party. I think a lot of it did. But it's clear that at least some of it, unlike in England, went to the Labour Party, went to Welsh Labour as well. Because a lot of these seats, of course, as in England, were Leave voting constituencies. Delyn here was 54% Leave. But the really fascinating thing I think for the Labour Party generally to chew over is how it has been that Welsh Labour has managed to at least retain some of its Leave voting support in a way that English Labour, if you like, if we can say such a thing, simply hasn't. It's going to be a really important conversation, I think, for the Labour Party. I mean, just generally, it wasn't a marginal seat, but it's just worth pointing out Mark Drakeford's seat in Cardiff West. An absolutely stonking performance by Mark Drakeford, the Welsh First Minister. 48% of the vote, gone up 13%. Big swing, 6.3% Conservative Labour swing, 11,000 votes now. At a time, as I say, when the Labour Party and the rest of the country, we're not talking about majorities like that or equivalent in their council seats. Welsh Labour not just hanging on in Wales, but thriving in parts of Wales, adding considerable numbers of votes. And of course, you could say maybe this is about the incumbency factor. We've seen in these elections how it appears to be that whether it's the Conservatives in England, whether it's the SNP in Scotland, whether it's Labour in Wales, that perhaps as a result of the pandemic, these figures, like Mark Drakeford in Wales, have been ubiquitous presence in our lives and perhaps getting a bit of gratitude from the voters as a result of their performance in the pandemic. But if one of the other elements as well that Welsh Labour, the other reasons that Welsh Labour managed to hold on to its majority or hold on to its position, preeminent position in Wales, is the position that is the performance that it had against Plaid Cymru. Now, Plaid Cymru were really hoping that they might actually make a real advance in this election, as I say, under their leader Adam Price. That clearly isn't going to happen. Have a look at this. These were some of the target seats that Plaid Cymru had. Indeed, in Rhonda's case, it was a seat that they already had. Their former leader, Leanne Wood, won this seat back in 2016. But look at that huge swing. In fact, I don't even have a swingometer basically big enough for this particular swing. 19% swing from Plaid Cymru to Labour there. So Leanne Wood losing her seat in Rhondda. Llanelli, that was Plaid Cymru's #1 target seat in Wales. 8.7% swing from Plaid Cymru to Labour. Caerphilly probably wasn't in significant danger, but if Plaid were having a really great night, then perhaps it may have been in danger. But again, a swing from Plaid Cymru to Labour of 5.9%. I think generally, as I say, very interesting set of results, Jo. A lot for Labour to chew on as they ponder their really quite baleful performance in many parts of England. As I say, very interesting that in Labour Wales and in particular in Leave voting areas, never forget, of course, Wales, like England, voted to leave the EU, that Welsh Labour seems, for whatever reasons we can speculate on, it might be partly that they're able to mine some of the Plaid vote, maybe the COVID factor and incumbency factor, as I said, but for whatever reasons, had a much more successful night. There's of the leaders of Wales, of the leaders of Labour, of course, across the country. There is one who's coming out with his authority very much enhanced at the moment after these elections, and it isn't Keir Starmer, it's Mark Drakeford.
Mark Drakeford. Lewis, thank you very much. And actually, we'll be talking to a member of his team shortly, Vaughan Gething in Wales. But first, two bits of news to tell you about. The SNP have held Aberdeen South, and the North Tyneside mayoralty has been held by the incumbent, Norma Redfern. So that's Labour's, not entirely surprising there. We're going to move on before I go to Vaughan Gething, because we're going to take a closer look now at how voting trends are moving across Britain with two experts. With me is Ben Page, Chief Executive of Ipsos Mori, and also I'm joined by Professor Nicola McEwen from the Centre on Constitutional Change at Edinburgh University. Welcome to both of you. Ben, your impressions, first of all, from the results so far?
Wow. Well, I think the elections have turned out to be much more exciting and interesting than local elections normally are, and records are being broken. I mean, two provisos first. Most people in England haven't bothered voting when they've been able to. It's only, I think, in Scotland where we've got a majority of people actually bothering to turn out in these elections, and it is post a pandemic with the vaccine rollout going well, which is definitely helping the government. Having said all that, events like Hartlepool are unprecedented. It's very unusual for a sitting government to take a seat off the opposition at a by-election. I think it's happened about twice now since since the early 1980s, and the size of the lead that they achieved there is astonishing. So you're seeing this recasting of politics in Britain, with the Conservatives, traditionally a middle-class party, doing best in working-class areas, particularly among older voters, and the Labour Party doing better among younger, more educated voters, but being really now confined to their urban centres. England is basically now Conservative largely. Wales, of course, Labour, beating the odds there and doing well. And in Scotland, it's all about the SNP. So the United Kingdom is divided, but the big losers at the moment do look to be Labour. We need a pinch of salt on all of this, because these are by-elections and local elections. But Keir Starmer is not going to be a happy man.
No, I mean, he won't be happy. But as we were just discussing before with two Labour pundits, they feel that in terms of the sort of baselines, if you're looking back at 2019, 2017 and 2016, it's not all doom and gloom in their mind. But Nicola, if we just go to Scotland and pick up Ben's point of a divided UK, that is going to underline any efforts, isn't it, by Nicola Sturgeon to go and ask for another second independence referendum?
Yeah, I mean, the story from Scotland, well, there's two things really. One is the continued dominance of the Scottish National Party, and the other is the turnout. I mean, the turnout in this election is higher than in any Scottish Parliament election we have had. And that's surprising in a sense, because it is a COVID election and we thought that might depress turnout. Also, the SNP were certain to win. Everyone expected so, even the opposition parties, and sometimes that might depress turnout. But what it tells us is that the stakes were high. And I think that's in part a reflection of the successful narrative that the Conservatives in particular were able to push in the campaign, and that was that victory for them was to stop the SNP winning a single party majority. The SNP, in a sense, allowed that narrative to prevail in a way to ensure that its voters would come out to the polls as well. But that leaves it with a bit of a challenge. While a single party majority is still a possibility, it's looking less likely than more likely at this stage. Votes are still being counted, of course. So that then gives rise to the issue of what constitutes a mandate? What constitutes a mandate for an independence referendum? Nicola Sturgeon has made clear that she's not in any hurry to push for that, but there is, and looks likely there will be, a parliamentary majority in the Scottish Parliament of parties who are committed to pushing a referendum on independence.
I mean, Ben, when we look at what was driving voters' decisions here, of course, we are only just now coming out of a pandemic, and there'll be a long tail of that. Being an incumbent probably has helped to some extent, hasn't it? We've seen it in Wales. With the performance of the Labour government there has been very strong. The SNP, as Nicola has been saying, I mean, it's not unexpected that they will be the largest party again and form the next government. And even for Boris Johnson, the vaccination programme. Oh, do you think that was uppermost? Those are the things that have been uppermost in people's minds?
I think, I mean, it's certainly the government is seen as having done a good job. And since October, the government's position on how it's coped with the pandemic has been getting steadily better. We've also seen a rapid rise in economic confidence. So generally, people feel comfortable with the government. Yes, Keir Starmer has narrowed the Conservative lead in the polls since he became leader. But in the last month or two, that he's slipped back, partly because of this vaccine bounce that we've seen. So yes, I think it is that. But underlying it all is this, I think, a massive psychological problem for the Labour Party, which is they think that if you're working class, the natural party for you is the Labour Party. And increasingly in Britain, that is no longer true. class is becoming less and less important, and it's much more about sort of cultural divides and people's aspirations. And at the moment, the Conservatives are absolutely capturing the centre-right votes. They've hoovered up former Leave voters, and Labour is facing a sort of leftish voters are now split between Labour, the Greens, of course, who are picking up council seats all over the place, and to a lesser extent the Lib Dems. So the Conservatives have united the Leave vote exactly as they did in 2019.
Yes.
And you know, this sort of cultural divide matters now more than your social class, which is fascinating to people like me.
All right, Ben Page, Nicola McEwen, thank you very much for joining me there. No problem. Talking about voting trends. I said we would be talking to Vaughan Gething, and I think he is there, Wales's Health Minister. Hello to you. Congratulations, first of all, Vaughan. Do you accept, and I don't mean to minimise your success in that sense, or the Welsh Government and Labour, but do you accept that incumbency has really helped here?
Well, incumbency is a challenge as well. It's a really powerful tool to say it's time for change after 22 years of Welsh Labour First Ministers. And a poll at the start of this campaign showed us 10 points behind the Tories here in Wales. So we had a mountain to climb. But it's because, I think, of the clarity of leadership and purpose we provided over this last year and the trust that people have gained and placed in us that I think we've had such a fantastic result. Leadership in the pandemic was a big issue on the doorsteps.
Yes.
People trusted us and they voted for us.
How are you going to govern going forward, Vaughan?
Well, it's going to be another big challenge because the pandemic itself not quite over yet, but we know there's a huge job to do with pandemic recovery in both health terms, educational terms and the economy. And we really need to see what the UK government is going to do with spending plans as well. We're going to have more tools in our armoury to help recover afterwards or a much more difficult time. We've got a manifesto that is realistic and achievable, and that's going to be the basis of how we're going to govern. We're in the fortunate position, though, having done so well at the top end of expectations, that we don't have to look for formal coalitions with other larger parties. We do, though, need to talk to other groups of people in the Senate because we don't have an absolute majority.
No, you don't have an absolute majority. Difficult, of course, with the system, so perhaps wouldn't be expected. Who will you talk to? Who are you likely to be talking to about working together?
Well, we're going to need to see the final results. Not all of the lists have declared yet, so we need to see who's left. And then we'll need to have conversations with progressive parties about what we're able to do. We've got a really strong mandate to lead and to govern, though. And there's no denying that. 30 seats is a fantastic result. Lots of the commentators, even up to yesterday, were trying to say we would have to do a deal with another large party, but it doesn't look like that sort of accommodation is going to be necessary. We had a really good night, a much more disappointing night, obviously, for Plaid Cymru. And the Tories themselves are talking much bigger gains in Wales, even just a couple of days ago. So I think a number of people didn't understand where people in Wales were. And that's not surprising, given that we've had such a short, condensed campaign over this last 5 weeks.
Yes, you sound a little bit surprised yourself, perhaps, by the scale of the success, are you?
No, I'm delighted because we knew it was an uphill battle, but in all the seats I've campaigned in, the people that I supported, the way we've looked at what we're doing here in Wales, we've had a really consistent message. We found it hard, though, to believe all the data coming back because we know we haven't done a full canvass in all of the constituencies in a way we normally would do.
No, but
so
that's affected everybody.
What's happening everywhere.
Yes, I mean, obviously that has affected everybody. You've mentioned the Conservatives. Of course, you've been working with them during the pandemic, working with Boris Johnson's government. Do you also accept that you've benefited from the furlough scheme, the government would say a generous furlough scheme, and the procurement of vaccinations, that has been a huge advantage?
Well, it's the way that the whole of the UK has had to resolve and work with the pandemic. That's undoubtedly helped the Conservatives in elections in every part of the UK. When it comes to vaccinations, of course, I think it's the best thing that the government has done in the pandemic together with the furlough scheme in procuring those vaccines, but delivery has all been on our shoulders here in Wales. And you may recall, Jo, in the first few weeks of the vaccination programme, there was lots of criticism of the approach we were taking here in Wales. We now have the best functioning and the fastest moving vaccination programme. And that was something people did mention on the doorsteps. They recognised that we had done a really good job in organising that rollout. And that definitely was a factor in why the public valued the Welsh Labour offer and why they voted for it.
What do you think's gone wrong for Sir Keir Starmer, the Labour leader?
I think it's really difficult when you've got a government that's working through the pandemic in England, when the vaccination programme is working in all parts of the UK, and we still have a mountain decline from 2019. Our toughest fights, the seats we were genuinely concerned about, were those that we lost to the Conservatives less than a year and a half ago in the December 2019 general election. We managed to win those seats back by working really hard here in Wales. We plainly still have more to go in England, but I'm optimistic we can get there, and I'm desperate to see a UK Labour Prime Minister to help take Wales forward and the UK forward.
OK, well, that's a good point to end. Vaughan Gething, thank you very much for joining us there, Wales's Health Minister. We've been talking about the mayoral contest with Lewis Goodall in England. Some of those will be declared later today, with Labour's Sadiq Khan holding a narrow lead over his Conservative rival Sean Bailey in London. And our correspondent Adina Campbell is at City Hall. Adina Campbell, are you surprised that it does seem to be slightly tighter than perhaps Labour had thought?
Well, going by the results we've had in so far, this is looking a lot tighter, a lot closer than first anticipated. There was lots of talk beforehand of Labour's Sadiq Khan sailing through comfortably to serve a second term as the next London mayor, but that clearly isn't looking like the case going by the results we've had in so far, with the Conservative rival Sean Bailey closely following behind him. At the moment, Sadiq Khan has a narrow lead of about 38%, followed by Sean Bailey at 37%. So it is looking like a two-man race. The other 18 candidates simply, miles away from the two front runners. There really is pressure on Labour to retain this position, because London is considered, Labour heartland, solid territory for the party. So it would be a massive blow if Labour were to lose this seat. So at the moment, we are waiting for more boroughs to declare their results over the next few hours. So it is a bit too early to jump to any sorts of conclusions. But at this stage, it is looking a lot tighter than what many people were expecting.
Adina Campbell there in London outside City Hall with the latest on the London mayoral contest. And of course, that's probably going to declare much later on this evening. Let's return to the contest in Scotland. Newsnight's policy editor Lewis Goodall is at the touch screen with a closer look. Lewis.
Yes, indeed, Jo. We've been talking about, can the SNP still achieve the majority? Now, I know there will be SNP supporters perhaps screaming at their television saying it's not just about a majority. Well, it's not just about a majority, but it has been an argument throughout the course of this campaign that majority would be making equivalent to the 2011 precedent, which led, of course, to the referendum. So it's clearly been something that the SNP have been desirous of, and indeed they're extremely close. We know that once we've filled in the rest of the map of Scotland from seats, we know what the result is going to be, that the SNP is going to do very well in those constituencies. They're going to be extremely close. The problem is getting up to the magic number of 65, and there it is looking a bit more difficult. Not least, we've just seen from 2 SNP seats already, but we've seen part of the problem in a way. We've just had a few more results. For example, in Aberdeen South, we see that Audrey Nicholl, she keeps the seat for the SNP, 42 to 38%. But we see here SNP vote not going up very much at all, Conservative vote going up more. Who are the challenges in the seat? Clear Labour direct transference to the Conservatives, clearly as an attempt to keep the SNP out. Hasn't worked in this case, but clearly there's unionist tactical voting going on. We've also had another result in the last hour or so in Aberdeenshire East, which is, there we go, get it to work, Aberdeenshire East. Here again, another SNP hold. Gillian Martin keeps the seat, majority of 1,889. 45% to 40% for the Conservatives. But again, we see something else similar happening here with the Lib Dem vote clearly transferring over to the Conservatives. More unionist tactical voting. Again, doesn't work. But it has worked in other seats which have been important in keeping the SNP from getting that majority. We saw it in Dumbarton, for example. Jackie Bailey's seat, the leader, or had been the leader before Anis Sarwar, the deputy leader of Scottish Labour in the Scottish Parliament. This was the #1 SNP target in Scotland, and they haven't done it. In fact, Jackie Bailey's majority went up. It went up because the Labour vote went up by 6%. The Conservative vote went down by 6%. Direct transference, and we saw a swing there from SNP to Labour of 1.8%. Now, as a result of missing out on Dumbarton, as a result of missing out in Eastwood, as a result of missing out in Dumfriesshire, there are only 2 seats which the SNP would absolutely have to need to win in order to potentially get to 65. They are Aberdeenshire West and they are Galloway. Galloway, they need a swing of 2.3% from the Conservatives to take it. In Aberdeenshire West, they need a swing of 1.3% in order for the Conservatives to take it. Well, that all sounds perfectly fine in theory, but bear in mind what we've just said about Aberdeenshire East, the 2 Aberdeenshire seats that we've just seen, Aberdeen South. Clearly tactical voting going on, and in the seats which the SNP failed to win, which which they needed to win to give them a really good chance of getting to 65. As I say, Dumfriesshire, Eastwood and Dumbarton we've already mentioned, but in these Conservative held seats there was a swing, 3.3% from the SNP to the Conservatives, 0.4% from the SNP to the Conservatives. So there is clearly significant tactical unionist voting going on. The unionists knew that this contest would all be fought in this tiny handful of constituencies, and they have voted with their feet accordingly and voted for the unionist candidate in whichever specific contest, whichever unionist candidate had the best chance of defeating the SNP or keeping the SNP at bay. Of course, then if there isn't a majority for the SNP on their own, attention will turn to the idea of a independence majority with the Greens. We're going to wait for the regional list votes to come through throughout the rest of the day. We're expecting the Greens to do very well on those, so it could well be that there is a quite significant, reasonably significant pro-independence majority for the SNP and the Greens taken together. But of course, what some SNP figures wanted, at least ideally, in their ideal world, would be to have an SNP majority on their own, as I say, to mirror the 2011 precedent. But nonetheless, make no mistake, the SNP remains hegemonic in Scotland, whether they get an extra seat, because it could literally be a matter of one seat to take them to 65 or not. They remain hegemonic. They're heading for another term in office. Nicola Sturgeon will be First Minister, and it seems that that central tension between London and Edinburgh, between Westminster and Holyrood about the future of the Union is going to endure.
Lewis Goodall bringing us up to date there with what is going on and continues to go on in Scotland. Just a little bit of breaking news. Labour's Steve Rotherham has been re-elected as the Liverpool Regional Mayor. Not a huge surprise. Now, let's get an overview of the election results across Britain so far. In Scotland, the ruling SNP's vote share has broadly held up, but it's failed to win a handful of crucial marginals. More council election results are also due in England today, as well as mayoral contests in London, Greater Manchester and the West Midlands. Counting's also continuing in elections to the Welsh Senedd. With this roundup, here's Greg Dawson.
The counting is far from over, but the arguments about Scotland and the future of the Union are already underway. There is no doubt the SNP is heading for a fourth consecutive term in power, but the indications are they may fall short of the overall majority that would strengthen their argument for another independence referendum. In an interview in this morning's Daily Telegraph, Boris Johnson says now is not the time for another vote, describing the prospect as reckless.
The UK government's position is very clear on this. We don't think there's a case for another referendum, particularly now as we try to chart a way out of the pandemic and get our economy going again. But, you know, we will obviously deal with whatever we have to deal with once these elections are settled and once the new Scottish administration decides what it wants to do.
Even if the SNP do fall short, a pro-independence majority in Holyrood is still likely once the Scottish Greens are allocated regional lists later today.
Central to our manifesto commitment was the proposition of there being a referendum on independence during this parliamentary term. I'm confident that there will be a majority for such a proposition in the Scottish Parliament after the election.
In Wales, a touch of relief for Labour, who defied the opinion polls and looks set to stay in power after matching its best ever Senedd election result with exactly half of 60 seats in the Welsh Parliament. The Tories are in second place ahead of Plaid Cymru, with their former leader Leanne Wood losing her seat.
Congratulations.
For the Labour Party in England, the mood is more reflective after yesterday's dramatic loss in Hartlepool continued the trend of being trumped by the Conservatives in former heartland areas.
We have to ask ourselves why it is that people have not seen Labour as the answer to the problems they face in their everyday lives and the injustices we see. And that's my point about what's happened over the last 4 defeats in general elections, whether it's in Hartlepool, other places as well, where people do not now see Labour as answering those concerns.
There is the prospect of some relief later for Keir Starmer, with the results of the London, Greater Manchester and Bristol mayoralties expected to go Labour's way. Greg Dawson, BBC News, Westminster.
That's all from me. Thank you for keeping me company. It's now time for a look at the weather with Ben Rich.
Hello, good afternoon. The Scottish National Party remains on course for an historic fourth term in office as counting continues in the Holyrood elections. Nicola Sturgeon's party still hopes to secure an outright majority, and this morning ministers insisted that they would pursue another independence referendum if it's supported by a majority of MSPs. Boris Johnson said such a move would be irresponsible and reckless. Well, these are the results as they stand, with more due to come in throughout the afternoon. With more then, our Scotland correspondent Lorna Gordon.
The following candidate is duly elected to serve as a member of the Scottish Parliament.
Another seat secured for the SNP, this time Aberdeen East.
For the Scottish National Party, SNP.
They've had some significant wins, while other target seats in this election have not fallen their way. But with results still to declare, the conflict ahead is becoming clear. The Prime Minister, writing in The Telegraph, describing calls for a second independence referendum as reckless and irresponsible, a message reiterated by a government minister today.
There was also a referendum that took place just a little over 5 years ago. That was described as a once-in-a-generation opportunity for people to debate these issues, and they did. And I think as we try to now come out of the pandemic and get economic recovery going as we come out of the pandemic, it's the wrong time to have yet another divisive referendum and yet another bout of constitutional argument on a matter such as this.
The regional lists are still being counted, but the SNP looks to be heading back into government and insists they would legislate for a second referendum if the Prime Minister were to block one.
We've said that we will take forward the legislation to do so, to have a legal referendum, and we already have put in place some of the legislative arrangements for that process, and we will embark on such an agenda should there be a majority for such a proposition in the Scottish Parliament.
So is there a pathway through?
It seems clear that there will be a pro-independence majority, which is all that they would need to get the vote through the Scottish Parliament. But ultimately, it may depend on how Downing Street reacts and how the UK Parliament reacts, because constitutionally, they hold the cards.
Inverclyde was an almost even split, narrowly voting no in the last independence referendum. At the outdoor pool in Gourock, which only reopened after COVID yesterday, the views were again divided.
I think it should be a second referendum because we won 38 out of 48 seats so far, which is just such a majority that people of Scotland are saying we need this referendum, we need independence.
I think there should be a referendum at all. I think as a United Kingdom, as a country, we've definitely worked better together, and especially financially.
A country divided on a constitutional question that is not going away. Lorna Gordon, BBC News.
Let's get the latest then from our political correspondent Nick Earley, who's at Holyrood for us now. Nick.
Yeah, the results are still being counted. The counting's back underway. It'll be later this evening probably before we know the full picture. An outright SNP majority is still possible, although it looks difficult. But what is pretty clear is that by the end of the day, when you factor in the Scottish Greens, the Scottish Parliament will have a majority of MSPs who stood on a manifesto saying there should be another independence referendum in the next 5 years. It's not as simple as that. We know that Downing Street isn't going to agree to one. We know that this is going to lead to a big political row. It could lead to a battle in the courts as well. But there's also a question that will be asked about what this means for the relationship between Scotland and the rest of the UK. If parties standing up for another referendum win a majority, is it right for Boris Johnson to say no? They're all questions that will be asked over the coming days. But what's also clear is that the country is still split. This is a big victory for the SNP, but the other unionist parties, when you tally up their votes, are pretty close to the SNPs overall. This country is divided on independence still.
Nick, thank you for that. Well, Labour is losing ground to the Conservatives in elections across England in the first big test of Sir Keir Starmer's leadership of the party. Several big city mayors are yet to be announced, including London, Manchester and the West Midlands. Well, these are the results of the local council elections as they currently stand. Labour has lost control of 4 councils, while the Conservatives have made 8 gains. Here's our political correspondent, Greg Dawson.
There may be many more ballots left to count in England, many more council and mayoral results to come. But it's yesterday's defeat in Hartlepool that will cast a significant shadow over Labour's overall election results. Another harsh reminder of the party losing the support of voters in former heartland areas and now prompting a major policy review to reconnect with voters.
We have to ask ourselves why it is that people have not seen Labour as the answer to the problems they face in their everyday lives and the injustices we see. And that's my point about what's happened over the last 4 defeats in general elections, whether it's in Hartlepool, other places as well, where people do not now see Labour as answering those concerns.
This afternoon, the Conservatives have their eyes on the ballot papers in Birmingham. If their candidate Andy Street is re-elected as West Midlands Mayor, it would complete the hat-trick of victories the party were hoping for, following Hartlepool and then the emphatic win for Tory Mayor Ben Houchin in the Tees Valley.
Parts of the country that haven't voted Conservative before, or at least for decades in some cases, are now putting their trust in this Prime Minister and this government. And yes, that's a big responsibility on us. We can't let people down.
Today, more signs of a familiar pattern, with the Conservatives picking up council seats from Labour in Rotherham and Cannock Chase. There should be better news for Labour when mayoral results are likely to confirm re-elections for Andy Burnham in Greater Manchester and Sadiq Khan in London. The party's also hoping for victory in the West of England mayoral contest. Greg Dawson, BBC News, Westminster.
Well, there's been a strong showing for Welsh Labour in the Senedd elections, with Mark Drakeford expected to remain as First Minister. This is the current situation, with Mr Drakeford's party having won 30 out of 60 seats so far. Our correspondent Thomas Morgan is in Cardiff for us with more.
Mark Drakeford was front and centre of Welsh Labour's campaign this year, and it clearly has paid off. They've equalled their best ever tally, just one shy of majority. So the question now for Mark Drakeford, the First Minister, and Welsh Labour is how will they rule as a government? Will they rule as a minority government, or will they seek a kind of less formal coalition, such as a confidence and supply deal? Or will they ask the sole remaining Lib Dem member of the Senedd to join them in a co-op, maybe? For the Tories, they did gain some seats, however they will be disappointed. They haven't been able to break the north-eastern red wall, simply dented it, just gaining 1 seat there. For Plaid Cymru, not a great day for them, losing former leader Leanne Wood in the Rhondda and not making any ground in their target seat of Llanelli. So Labour, a great day for them, not so great for the Tories or Plaid. Lib Dems holding their seat, and not a seat so far, with only 4 yet to declare for abolish the Welsh Assembly.
Thomas, thank you. Well, in other news, officers investigating the death of serving police community support officer Julia James in Kent have arrested a man in connection with her murder. Sean Dilley is in Snowdown for us with more. Sean.
Well, the officers have said that a man from the Canterbury area in his 20s was arrested at around 9:30 p.m. last night in connection with the murder of the 53-year-old police community support officer Julia James. Now, officers are saying that this notwithstanding, they are still asking people to come forward with any information that relates to Tuesday the 27th of April. Particularly keen, they say, to speak to anybody who was in the area between 1 p.m. and 4:30. Maybe you felt uncomfortable that you had to cross the road or that you had to change your route. Any of that information, CCTV and dash cams, they are saying it's really important that people do come forward.
OK, Sean, thank you. Several of the UK's busiest rail lines are facing severe disruption after cracks were spotted on some high-speed trains. LNER is asking passengers not to travel on the East Coast Main Line today, and many Great Western services to Bristol and Penzance have also been cancelled, as well as Hull trains and TransPennine. Our business correspondent Katie Austin reports.
This type of high-speed train has only been on UK railways for a few years. This morning, Class 800 series Hitachi trains weren't running.
The problem is a weld underneath the body shell, which is cracking, which sounds like metal fatigue. There are over 180 of these trains in service, which were grounded at 5 o'clock this morning, while the engineers checked to see whether any more were cracking.
And will that be easy to fix?
No, repairing aluminium trains is very difficult. So no, it's not quick and it's not cheap.
It's caused major disruption today on several networks: LNER, Hull Trains, Great Western and TransPennine.
It's a disaster for me because I'm actually going for my vaccine in Cardiff, and my appointment's at 3 p.m.
I was going to go back to uni, to Exeter, and I can't go back, which is so annoying.
Hitachi is now checking all the trains. It's unclear at this stage exactly how widespread the problem is. A spokesperson said some have been taken out of passenger service as a precautionary measure to allow for thorough investigations, and that Hitachi is working to resolve the issue as quickly and safely as possible. The company apologised to passengers for the impact on travel plans. Even with some of the trains already coming back into use, further disruption is likely to follow. Katie Austin, BBC News.
Finally, Manchester City are on the brink of winning the Premier League. They'll be crowned champions if they beat Chelsea later today. Ben Crouch is at the Etihad Stadium for us with more.
Yeah, big game in a big month for Manchester City. What could be another title in another superb season. It's been a remarkable turnaround from them as well. They were a distant second to Liverpool last year. They were in the bottom half of the table in December, but then won 15 games in a row to put them on the verge of a third title in 4 years. And if it feels like it's a matter of when rather than if, the if is the big question today. Chelsea are in good form. They're chasing a top 4 spot themselves, and they've got the meanest defence in the league since January. And if this game needed any more subplots, it's a rehearsal for the Champions League final as well. The City boss Pep Guardiola, though, says that this game and this competition are most important for now anyway.
All right, Ben, we'll see what happens. Next news is on BBC One at 6 o'clock. We'll see you then, hopefully, but bye-bye for now.